CD4.
Number 5, Calle San Isidro, Madrid. Prison for nursing mothers. Wednesday, the 21st of January, 1948. Every morning for 8 years, the whole time she had spent at Las Ventas prison, Teresa had got up, not knowing whether she would lay her head on her bedroll again that night or face the firing squad before the day was out. Whenever one of her cellmates was taken away, they were never sure to return. And so, ever since her little Gordi was born one stifling hot July afternoon, Teresa had spent every moment she could clutching her daughter to her breast, telling her all about Tomeo and the endless olive groves of El Palomar. She wanted to tell her little Gordi everything about her roots and her ancestors' struggles before she was snatched away from her. She whispered the sounds of her village and the words of her beloved Tomeo into her daughter's ear, to imprint their love in her memory like a song she would come to know by heart. One January morning 2 years earlier, the guards had come for them, to take them away from Las Ventas to this prison for nursing mothers on Calle San Isidro. Gordi had been barely 6 months old. It had been such a cold night that Teresa and her cellmates had all huddled around their precious little girl to protect her scrawny little body as best they could with their own skin and bones. The guards had woken them before dawn in a shroud of chilling silence. Teresa was sure they had come to take her to her death, so she was surprised when they ordered her to follow them without tearing her daughter from her arms. She'd had no idea why she'd been spared. Maria had sighed with relief. Her sweet Maria. Teresa had not even had the chance to say goodbye. But even in her absence, she could feel her near. They were united by blood, as Maria said. Spilled blood. There had been a lot of talk inside Las Ventas about Calle San Isidro, where mothers were allowed to stay with their children until they turned 3. And then the children, Republican offspring, were sent off to boarding schools or orphanages to be brainwashed into Franco's disciples. On Calle San Isidro, there were said to be blue cribs for baby boys, pink for baby girls, and separate beds for older children. Proper beds with clean sheets and blankets. Now a shiver ran through Teresa. She was sharing the window with 2 other women, fists clenched and eyes riveted to the courtyard below. It was a miserable day, cold and damp. It had even rained that morning. But the children still spent the whole day outside in the courtyard, frozen from head to toe. They were unsupervised, so their mothers tried to watch over them from the surrounding buildings. The guards only stepped in to beat the children, retrieve babies for their feed, or walk the older children to the refectory. Dinner time was another fun experience. Day after day the children were forced to swallow the same old lentil and carob bean stew. It was full of insects, which they would often vomit right back up again. It was no wonder some kids would instinctively lick the plaster on the walls to make up for the lack of calcium. Teresa caught sight of her daughter. Gordi emerged from behind one of the cribs scattered around the courtyard. She was helping a little girl back to her feet. The poor mite was just learning to walk and had tripped and fallen face first in the mud. Her teeth were black with dirt, and she was screaming. Gordi took it upon herself to clean her up with the water from a puddle. Then she hugged the child with her scrawny arms before returning to sit in the centre of the courtyard, where the sun offered a little warmth, pulling her skirt over her bare legs. Gordi. That was the nickname Maria had given her. Teresa's daughter had been born so skinny, her friend had given her a pet name that would put some meat on her bones. Gordi. The chubby one. Teresa smiled. Her daughter was a good soul. Gordi knew that if the little girl cried for too long, one of the guards would come outside and beat her. Because on Calle San Isidro, there were no blue cribs, no pink cribs, and even fewer beds. The infamous cribs had been abandoned in the courtyard, and so had the children. Separated from their mothers all day long, except for one precious hour they were allowed to spend together. Gordi hugged her arms to her chest to warm herself up, and looked up at the windows surrounding the courtyard, trying to spot her mother. She knew better than to wave at her, though. She mustn't draw the guards' attention. Looking at each other had to be their little secret. Teresa had explained to her daughter how they could communicate with the language of the heart. She could use her eyes to tell her about her nightmares and fears, and whisper messages only her mother would hear, while she, Teresa, could hug her tight in return and kiss her forehead and snub little nose, the way she always did in Las Ventas. Gordi had caught on straight away, because she had seen that the children who cried until their voices cracked were beaten. Suddenly one of the guards appeared with a screaming baby in her arms. She left the infant in the nearest crib without a blanket and promptly went back inside the prison. The cries of the starving newborn echoed around the walls of the courtyard. Babies were only allowed to suckle their mother's breast twice a day, so for an hour at most. The bare minimum to make sure they weren't poisoned by their mother's communist milk, the guards kept saying. The baby's mother was echoing the cries from inside her cell. She was banging at the window, screaming her son's name, her blouse soaked with milk, which kept on flowing. Gordi searched for Teresa with her eyes and nodded when she saw her. It was the very tiniest of nods, just as they had agreed. Teresa felt a weight like a sledgehammer slam into her chest, as if her heart was beating so hard it would burst out of her body. She placed one hand against the window in reply to her daughter, as she said she would. Just for a few seconds. The newborn was still screaming when they took Teresa away. His tired little voice would fade away for a few notes, before coming back loud and strong. Teresa felt the gaze of her daughter's brown eyes on her shoulder when she left the prison. She could hear last night's nightmare and sweet whispered nothings cupped in those dirty little hands and blown like kisses. She hoped that one day her Gordi would start dreaming instead, that she would have children of her own, children who would dip churros in hot chocolate and get sugar all over their fingers, not dirt. She held her so tight in her heart it ached, and, with a sigh, she called out to her Tomeo, reached out for him to join them in their little bubble of love, to say goodbye, or perhaps hello again, because surely this couldn't be the end, could it? There must be something on the other side after all this, surely, after all these battles. Not God, but something else. When she looked down the barrel of the gun, Teresa was surprised to find herself raising her fist and chanting "No pasarán" over and over, a little louder each time, thinking about her fallen comrades and those still fighting, and holding her Gordi and her Tomeo tight to her chest, until a bullet silenced her cry.
Lindbergh Clinic, Gothenburg, Monday, the 5th of December, 2016, 4:10 p.m. Bergström met Emily and Olofsson at the entrance to the clinic. The compact reception area was all white, with a few photos of round bellies and tiny newborn feet adorning the walls. On the narrow sofas in the waiting area, 4 couples sat in uncomfortable proximity to one another. Bergström noticed the resignation on their faces, the torture of not having a child. These couples seemed to be grieving, suffering under the weight of their quest. They were preparing to challenge God, perhaps with the help of a stranger who would become the progenitor of their child. Some stared at their phones or their own clasped hands, while others gazed at the snapshots on the walls flaunting what they couldn't have, or couldn't have yet. But they all shared the despondent look of those on whom Mother Nature frowns. Bergström paused for a moment to compare his good fortune to their struggle. The receptionist gestured to the commissioner and directed him, Emily, and Olofsson up to the 4th floor. Leopold Lindberg was waiting for them behind a glass-paned security door. With a swipe of a card, he opened the door and nodded a greeting before leading them into a vast office where 2 desks faced each other. Along the wall on the right was a 3-seater sofa, flanked by 2 armchairs. The wall on the left was chock full of books from floor to ceiling. "You wanted to see my parents' office. Well, here we are, Commissioner, and here are all the clinic's files," Leopold said, holding out a USB stick. "The prosecutor has assured us that none of this will be disclosed, and that you will notify us before contacting our patients so we can make the necessary arrangements." Bergström nodded. "If you need anything, I'll be in my office. 3rd door on the left on your way out," he said, walking to the door. "Before you go, Mr. Lindberg, could you tell me whether the clinic was involved in any ongoing legal action or whether it was dealing with any dissatisfied clients?" the commissioner asked. Leopold Lindberg turned around reluctantly. "We have never been involved in legal action, Commissioner. As for unhappy patients, yes, of course there were some. Those who weren't able to conceive, but there aren't many of them. You can see all that in the files. No issues or disagreements with any ex-employees?" Hey, a voluptuous woman entered the Lindbergs' office and stood beside Leopold, as generous in her presence and gestured as he was sparing. She flashed them a radiant smile that creased her face from ear to ear. "Senior Score, I'm the clinical manager." She pressed her palms together, as if she had just been applauding. "Senior is running the clinic now as well, until we find someone more capable," she interjected, her smile never faltering. "I'm not doing too badly, but I'm not really cut out for running a business." Leopold swept his eyes across the floor and out the door. "Feel free to leave us," she said in a gentle voice. He nodded in silence and disappeared down the corridor. Senia shook her visitors by the hand, touching a warm, protective palm to each of their arms. When Emily introduced herself, Senia paused for a moment before switching to English. "Emily Roy, you're the police officer who took Alienor under her wing, aren't you?" "That's right. Alienor works alongside me now," Emily answered, returning the smile. "Shestin told me about you. What a pleasure it is to meet you." "Senia, do you mind if we continue in English?" Emily asked. "Not at all. It's easier for me, in fact, because English is the language we use here at the clinic, even among ourselves. I have to admit, sometimes I feel like I'm forgetting my Swedish." She sat in one of the armchairs and invited them to take a seat on the sofa. "I interrupted you when I came in. What were you saying?" "I was asking whether the clinic currently has any issues with patients or former employees," Bergström explained. "We have a very high success rate, so disappointed clients are a rarity. Nevertheless, sometimes we're simply not able to give Mother Nature a helping hand. So we do come up against a few desperate patients who are unfortunately let down by medically assisted reproduction." "Has the clinic ever been taken to court?" Senia shook her head vehemently. "No, never. Patients who don't manage to conceive walk away dejected and exhausted from their months of treatments. The last thing they feel like doing is fighting the clinic that moved mountains to try and find a solution to their problem. These couples need peace and quiet, not confrontation or legal battle, believe me." "What about by other MAR clinics? Any disputes with them?" "No, not at all. How about employees who left to work for the competition? No problems there that I'm aware of. What are some of your most challenging cases? Emily suddenly asked. Senya uncrossed her legs. Her chest swelled, stretching her beige velvet blazer. It might come as a surprise, but it's not the cases that are related to the sterility of one or both members of the couple that are the trickiest. It's the cases of unexplained infertility that cause the greatest difficulties. In other words, perfectly healthy couples who are unable to conceive for reasons we can't discover. Were you aware of any problems at the clinic that might explain what happened to the Lindberg family? Emily continued. Senya's fingers strayed to her short hair, shifting a few brown strands. Nothing that could explain anything like that. Did you know the Lindberg as well, Miss Skor? Yes, Göran and I have known each other for more than 40 years. He and my husband met at business school in Stockholm. Not just any business school, I might add. The Handelshögskolan is the most renowned business school in the country. Senya paused and held the silence for a moment, staring into space as her mind wandered. Göran was a brilliant man, she suddenly continued. Truly brilliant, in everything he set his mind to. And Kerstin? Kerstin was more than just a pretty face. She was the secret of Göran's success. She set his boundaries and frequently adjusted them. In what sense? Göran always aimed too high, too quickly. He was impatient. He never left time for time, as the French like to say. She flashed Emily a smile, one of those mechanical ones that don't spread to the eyes. So Kerstin used to put up roadblocks, to slow him down a bit. He would protest, of course, but he always ended up listening to his wife. They had a symbiotic relationship. There was a strong bond between them, according to their children. Oh, yes, there was. Senya looked down at her hands. She turned a ring around her middle finger, then placed her palms on her thighs and sat up straight, all prim and proper. Were you aware of any conflicts in the family? Any tension or quarrels, or issues with people outside the family? She shrugged her shoulders slightly. Only that raising and educating Alianor was a challenge. That child threw the family off balance when she came along. The pregnancy was unplanned, and by the time Kerstin realized she was expecting, it was far too late to abort. Their family was growing again, whether they liked it or not. How did Leopold and Louise take to the new family dynamic? Leopold has always been very reserved. Exceptionally intelligent, but a bit inept, socially speaking. Not on the autism spectrum, in case you're wondering. Let's just say he's happier working with lab rats than people. He earned his doctorate with flying colors, but he's always had trouble finding and keeping a girlfriend. He doesn't know how to take care of the people he loves. Louise was the complete opposite of Leo. She wore her heart on her sleeve, always brimming with kindness and empathy, the kind of smile that lights you up from head to toe. She was a beautiful person, inside and out. She would give you a little part of herself with that smile of hers. And Louise adored her sister. Kerstin, by contrast, used to joke that Alianor was her own personal charity case. Charming, Olafsson scoffed. Yes, I know, Signa agreed. It's a pretty harsh thing to say. For a mother, I mean. It's a harsh thing for anyone to say, Bergström added. Yes, I suppose you're right, Senya replied, blinking a few times. Do you know why Louise left her position here at the clinic? Emily pressed. Bergström raised an eyebrow. Emily and Christian must have gleaned that piece of information from Albin Monson. Sinja sighed deeply. She didn't like working with her father. And to be honest, having the two of them here together was a pain for the rest of us, because all they did was shout at each other. It was exhausting. Was it a big conflict that pushed Louise out in the end? Sinja shook her head. No, I wouldn't say that. They just weren't made to work together, and were incapable of communicating. It was unbearable. Have you been working at the clinic for long, Sinja? Ever since it opened, in 1990. Do you know Karina Isaksson? Their neighbor in Falkenberg? Yes. And Göran's mistress, too. Sinja blinked, and her mouth dropped open a little. Olofsson felt a sudden craving for popcorn. This was like a scene from a movie. Emily was going for the jugular now. Talk about a sly character. She had buttered the witness up, flashed a couple of warm, friendly smiles, and then bam! In came the uppercut, followed by a little jab at the back to throw her opponent off and draw a natural reaction, not a calculated response. He bet she really knew how to dig her claws into a man. Sinja shook her head in disbelief. Are you sure? Emily let it sink in. It was enough to keep looking the witness in the eye. How come your success rate is so high? She asked finally. Sinja stared at her, lost for words. She swallowed before delivering her reply. Because we have excellent treatment protocols. That's what we've heard. We've also heard you use experimental treatments. Excuse me? Her brown eyes drilled into Emily. I would never allow such a thing, Ms. Roy. Never. Sinja Skor paused, still glaring at Emily, as a mask of determination hardened her face. If this is the way our conversation is going, Ms. Roy, Commissioner, Detective, I must refer you to our solicitor. My secretary will see you out. She stood up and left the room. Falkenberg Police Station, Monday, the 5th of December, 2016, 10:30 p.m. Alexei pushed a mug in front of Emily. She cupped her own between her palms, held her nose to the edge to breathe in the aroma of the steaming black tea. Her eyes flicked from one crime scene photograph to another. Alexei had called Emily earlier that evening to find out whether the Medically Assisted Reproduction Association had shed any light on the Lindberg clinic. By way of reply, Emily asked her to come to the station. And so, like an eager child, Alexei had left Stellan to his own devices and hurried off to see what the profiler had to say. Stellan had only held her back for a moment, pulling her body to his, stroking her neck with his fingertips and pressing his lips to her hair. She had surrendered to his embrace, basking briefly in what had felt like the afterglow of passion. When Alexei arrived at the police station, Emily had just started combing through the hundreds of patient files they had been given at the clinic. They were all in English, reflecting the international profile of its clients and staff. Alexei had rolled up her sleeves straight away and started examining the interviews, autopsy results, and police and forensic reports with the giddy excitement she always felt at the beginning of a new investigation. There's no DNA evidence to prove it, but the forensics experts seem to share your opinion that the assailant must have been lying in wait under Kerstin Lindberg's bed, Alexei announced. Unsurprisingly, Emily didn't say anything in response, so Alexei kept on reading. Alexei was scrutinizing a photograph of Louise's bloodied chest when it dawned on her how quickly she always glossed over a victim's identity. It was a salutary reflex. one she had honed through years of researching the most gruesome of news stories. She swallowed a mouthful of tea and pushed away the image of Aliénor that had floated into her mind. "Don't you think it's strange that Louise was the second victim but appears to have been the main target?" she asked, keeping her eyes on the photograph. "Or perhaps she wasn't," Emily replied. "If she wasn't, how do you explain her 19 stab wounds versus 11 for Shishin and only 4 for Yuran? Well, not only, that's a poor choice of words, but you know what I mean. Starting with the mother and then going crazy on the daughter sends 2 contradictory messages." Emily stood and moved over to the whiteboard. Her finger landed on a photograph of Yuran's body lying on the sofa. The killer smashed Yuran's skull, then put the headphones back on his ears and replaced the candlestick where it was. Louise was also covered up with the duvet, but Shishin was left on the floor with the bedsheets scrunched up at her feet. "Do you think Shishin Lindberg was the killer's main target?" "Yes, if we trust what the crime scene is telling us." "What about Louise being stabbed nearly twice as many times, though? How do you explain that? The killer might not have intended to kill Louise. She didn't live at home, and her being there might have been a surprise. It's quite possible Louise messed up the killer's plan, so he or she took their frustration out on her." "He or she? Do you think the killer could be a woman?" "There's nothing to prove we're dealing with a man, and nothing to contradict the theory of a female perpetrator. And let's not forget, Louise was killed in Aliénor's bedroom." They were interrupted by the swing doors creaking open. Mona poked her head into the room. "I'm sorry to interrupt, Miss Roy, but Aliénor Lindberg wants to speak with you. She's waiting in the corridor." Emily nodded. "I'll send her in," Mona said, as Alexei flipped the whiteboard over so Aliénor wouldn't see the crime scene photographs of her family. Aliénor stepped into the conference room a few seconds later, still bundled up in her parka. "What are you doing here, Alexei?" Her abrupt tone was like claws scraping a blackboard. "I'm here to help Emily." Aliénor looked from Alexei to the blank whiteboard, then focused on Emily. "I forgot to tell you. Louise used to work for the clinic, up until 3 years ago. She left because things weren't going well with Dad. I should have told you on Saturday, but I couldn't get my thoughts in order." "It's all right, Aliénor." Aliénor shifted her gaze to the whiteboard again. "I want to know how they were killed." Emily shook her head. "No, Aliénor. I know why you don't want me to know, because those images will stay with me. But I have other images in my head anyway, and my mind keeps conjuring up more. They're horrible. They leave a taste of blood in my mouth, and they smell of death, or rather the way I imagine death smells. The images in my mind are terrifying me. They're making me ill, and they're always there, even when I close my eyes. You'll need help and support if you want to know the details. I do have support, but I need to know what happened to them before I can start to grieve, and I want to help, too, like Alexei." Emily sat back down at her computer and looked up at her protégé. Alexei saw resignation in Emily's face, but no compassion. "Nothing significant in your past?" Emily barked. "Any tension or conflict? Any relationships that ended badly?" "Absolutely nothing," Aliénor replied, taking no offense at Emily's onslaught of questions. "Any interactions with my classmates were almost non-existent. It exhausts me, applying and adhering to all the social codes that seem necessary for maintaining friendships. My relationships with my teachers were always cordial, and I've never had a boyfriend or a girlfriend, only sexual partners of both genders, and I've had no conflicts with them either." "Was your sister in the habit of sleeping in your bedroom?" The question hit Alexei like a slap in the face. She would never be able to explain the profiler's emotional viciousness to the people she cared about. A stunned Alienor managed to blink. No, Louise wasn't in the habit of sleeping in my room. Her gaze sank to the floor. She unbuttoned her parka, giving her childlike body room to breathe. Alexei felt her throat nodding with anger. Did Louise die in my bedroom, Emily? Yes. She was in my room, surrounded by my books and my things, in my bed. Yes. So I was with her when she died. Yes, you were there, Alienor, as if you were holding her in your arms. Alexei froze in amazement. She had been too quick to judge her friend. Do you think I was the target? I have considered the possibility, but now I doubt that was the case. All right. Emily stared at her screen and let the silence sink in, giving Alienor time. Time to slow her breathing, relax her face, unclench her hands. Time for her to register the brutal shock of this information in her body and mind before analyzing and digesting it. Can you have a look at Louise's computer? Emily eventually asked, looking at Alienor to gauge her reaction. Yes? Is it here? No. Forensics are still examining it. You should be able to pick it up in a day or two. What am I looking for information about? Albin Månsson? The clinic? Emily nodded. If it's not all right, just stop. Okay? I'm with Louise, Emily. It's going to be all right. You'll see.
La Virgen de los Desamparados Orphanage, Madrid, Monday the 8th of January 1951. Gordi was already awake when the morning whistle blew. In the other orphanage, she had developed the habit of getting up long before anyone else, so she could go and drink without alerting the nuns and risking a thrashing. They had only been allowed 1 glass of water a day at noon, and it was often salty. In the morning and evening, they were given milk, 1 glass each time. So Gordi was thirsty, all the time. It was the kind of thirst that burned her throat and the pit of her stomach when she urinated. And so, before anyone else was awake, she and 2 of the others would always sneak into the courtyard to siphon any stagnant water from the plant pots after they were watered. And if there was nothing left, they would drink from the toilets. Last night, when she got up to drink, she had lost her way in the maze of corridors. She must have thought she was still back in the other orphanage. She'd been trying to get to the yard, but had gone the wrong way. Fortunately, she had run into another girl, who had helped her find her way back to her bed. "You'd better figure things out for yourself, new girl, and quick, or Sister Fernanda will be on you like a ton of bricks." Gordi turned. It was the girl who had helped her back to the dormitory in the early hours of the morning. She has a smile like the sea, Gordi thought. A smile that makes you want to look and sigh. "I'm 101, and my sister there, she's 102. But we call each other La Una and La Dos," she went on. "And I'm 134, Reme," a little blonde-haired girl with a short fringe said from the bed opposite. "I'm 145, Dulce." Another girl followed suit. Her face was peppered with freckles. "What about you?" she asked, pulling on her dress, socks and shoes. "Gordi, 162. "Gordi, that's funny. How old are you, Gordi?" 5. Nearly 6. The girls began their morning ritual, and Gordi followed their lead. "Get dressed. Make the bed." "Where were you before?" Dulce asked. "In another orphanage. In Barcelona." "Whatever you do, don't speak Catalan," said La Dos, "or Sister Fernanda will wash your mouth out with soap." "I can't speak Catalan." Just as well. That'll save you some hassle. They didn't chop off your curls, then? La Dos carried on, smoothing her bedsheet and folding back the thin blanket. They cut mine off because they were things of the devil, they said, and my hair was so short I could almost have gone to hear Mass with the boys. They all burst into a chorus of laughter, but it quickly fell flat. They sprang to attention beside their beds, standing as still as statues, hands clasped behind their backs, as Sister Fernanda breezed into the dormitory in a shroud of silence. Her rosary brushed against her habit, which swished as she walked. Holding a whip in her hand, fashioned from leather belts Father Murillo had taught her to braid together, she inspected every bed one by one, stripping some of the sheets back to make sure the mattresses were dry. "Attention! Forward, march!" she shouted, once the last bed had passed inspection. The entire dormitory scrambled to form one long, meticulous line, and all the girls began to march forwards in unison, like an army of ants. Only one dark-haired girl, who was as white as a sheet, tripped out of line every few steps. "Forward, march!" Sister Fernanda commanded, giving her a shove in the back. Gordi wondered whether this scrawny girl was the one who had sobbed all night long, or the one who had moaned in her dreams and called out for her mother. Gordi would not have been able to call to her mother, because she could not remember her. Try as she might, she could conjure up no image of her mother. Nor could she recall the sound of her voice, or the way she smelled. All that came was a curious sensation that swelled in her chest and filled her with both joy and sadness. The little dark-haired girl fell out of line completely now. Sister Fernanda grabbed her by the hair and flung her against the wall. The other girls stopped marching and waited with bated breath. The only sounds to break the silence were a thud and a crack as the child's face hit the wall, and the damage was done. Shaking, the girl rose to her feet. She quickly wiped away the blood that was gushing from her lips and ran her tongue over her broken tooth before shuffling back to her place in line with the others. "That'll teach you not to step out of line," Sister Fernanda chided. "Attention! Forward, march!" Gordi did like the others and marched forwards. The clicking of the nuns' rosary was like a metronome setting the pace of their steps. She wondered where they were going. To the refectory for breakfast. To the showers, perhaps. She hoped they weren't. That had not been a pleasant experience when she arrived the previous day. The stream of water was so cold, it had felt like it was drilling into her head. The numbing pain had seized her skull in a vice-like grip and not let go until it was time for bed. The nun suddenly hastened her pace and stepped ahead of them to push open the door to the big courtyard. A glacial wind swirled its way beneath their dresses, whipping their faces and legs. The march slowed to a crawl, and the line splintered into 5 rows before breaking out into a rendition of Cara al Sol. Gordi knew that song. She had learned it in the other orphanage. She didn't understand what the lyrics meant, but she knew the most important thing, that she had no choice but to sing the praises of El Caudillo, Señor Franco. If she wanted to live, she had to sing. May these flags return victorious at the joyful pace of peace. May there be 5 roses tied to the arrows of my quiver. May the springtime smile once more on the sky, the land, and the sea. May a new day dawn on Spain. Now onwards, legions, to victory. Spain united, Spain the great, Spain the free. Now onwards, Spain.
Falkenberg Police Station, Tuesday, the 6th of December, 2016, 8 a.m. Emily entered the conference room, followed by Alexei and Bergström, who was carrying a tray of croissants, mugs, and a thermos flask. Olofsson was leaning against the table, waiting for them, his muscular torso stretching the seams of a sweater that left little to the imagination. "What? No kanelbulle this morning?" the detective protested, grabbing one of the flaky pastries. "We can ask Mona to bring you one if you like," Alexei teased as she poured everyone a coffee. "Oh, come on. Not you too. I wish you'd all give it a rest about Mona. Anyway, aren't you supposed to be off somewhere, choosing your centerpieces or something?" "Ooh, look at you, Christian, the wedding planner." Olofsson rolled his eyes and conceded a smile to Alexei, just as Mona glided through the swing doors. She nodded good morning to everyone and took a seat at the far end of the conference room table, avoiding eye contact with Olofsson. The detective mumbled a quick hello, trying to shake from his mind the image of Mona in the skimpiest of attire, moaning with pleasure earlier that morning. He flicked a few flakes of croissant from the corners of his mouth and went to sit beside Alexei. "Why don't we start with you, Mona? Then we can let you go," said Bergström. "Yes, of course, Commissioner." The young rookie smoothed a lock of dark hair behind her ear before continuing. "There was a regular audit of the Lindberga clinic 18 months ago, and that didn't detect any irregularities. No legal action has ever been taken against the clinic either. Leopold Lindberga, Sinja Skår, and Albin Månsson had nothing in their past that we could find. Stockholm also got back to me. All other cases of victims being stabbed and having their tongues cut out were very different kinds of murders from the Lindbergas. I've emailed you the details of them all, and here's a printout." Mona passed the papers to the commissioner. Bergström gave the document straight to Emily, who started leafing through it. To give you an idea, the Lindberga case is unprecedented in Sweden. There's been no other family massacre with this kind of modus operandi. Any other cases involving tongues being cut out were gang-related, and any other knife murders were committed in completely different circumstances, and most of those cases are closed. As for Interpol, Commissioner, they'll be sending you their report today, this evening at the latest. Perfect. Thank you. Mona nodded and left the room as discreetly as she had entered, again averting her gaze from her lover across the table. Christian, you spoke to Yarda van Card, didn't you? Yes, the detective smiled, thrilled to avoid another swipe at his private life. She confirmed that Göran Lindberga and Carina Isaksson were having an affair, and that Kirsten Lindberga knew all about it. Yarda was tight-lipped about the whole thing, but I certainly got the sense she would have had plenty to say, given the chance. I also spoke with Yarda's companion, who confirmed her alibi. It's true that Nicole's daughter popped a sprog that night, but she really can't stand Yarda. So Yarda decided to go back to the Lindbergas. Or home to her place, as she puts it. Where are we at with the Lindbergas' phones, computers, and tablets? The techies didn't find anything to write home about, besides the fact the old man, Alionor's father, was watching RedTube videos back to back. RedTube? Bergström asked. Online porn, Emily interjected, without looking up from the file Mona had put together. Olofsson wolfed down the last mouthful of his croissant with a swig of coffee. This profiler was always full of surprises, he thought. Bergström raised his eyebrows briefly before continuing. And what about Louise's computer? Nothing there either, at least for now, Olofsson replied. I've asked Alionor to take a look at it, Emily said. Bergström whirled around and glared at her as his surprise turned to anger. Seriously, Emily? She knew her sister very well, Lennart, Emily coolly replied. How am I supposed to explain that to Möller? The commissioner thundered. Maybe the prosecutor doesn't need to know about it, boss, Olofsson volunteered. Oh, come on. Don't give me the Olofsson method. And somehow I'm always the one who takes the flak, the detective muttered to himself, slumping back in his chair. "Good grief, Emily! You're going to get me up to my eyes in trouble," Bergström hissed. "We've done a first round of sorting through the patient files from the Lindberga clinic," Alexei cut in. Still seething, Bergström turned to look at his future sister-in-law. Without losing her cool, Alexei carried on explaining her findings. "We started by isolating those cases where MAR treatment failed, which were about a quarter of all patients. That might seem like a colossal percentage, but the Lindberga Clinic's success rate is actually as phenomenal as they claim. It's far higher than their competitors. 2/3 of those patients are either from abroad or have since moved overseas. The other third live in Sweden." "Okay, good," Bergström ceded in a calmer tone of voice. "Let's start with them. Then we'll cast the net further geographically. Emily?" The profiler was staring into the empty space behind Bergström, as if thoughts and images were commanding her mind, and her body was somewhere far from the room. At the sound of her name, she gave a start and pulled herself together. She rose and went over to the whiteboard. "We're dealing with an organized killer who prepared meticulously for these crimes and acted with great precision. The perpetrator knew when and how to get into the house without breaking in, and they knew about the Lindberga's habits and flaws, so it was easy to enter the premises in their absence. This was a familiar hunting ground for a trained and seasoned killer who tracked the victim's movements, as we can see from the precise sequencing of the MO. This probably isn't the first time they've killed, and the sequence has likely been honed for maximum efficiency. Take the victim by surprise, knock them out to render them immobile, stab them, cut their tongue out, then take the time, somewhat arrogantly, I might add, to stage their bodies for the benefit of the police, like we saw with Louise and Göran. I'll come back to Kerstin in a moment. The killer also came prepared with protective overalls, which would explain the absence of fibers under the Lindberga's bed and the droplets of blood right by the door in the hall, where the killer must have taken their suit off before leaving the house. The killer brought their own weapon, and the way the tongues were cut out in one slice without any hesitation suggests this is a familiar act, and the tongues were almost certainly taken away from the scene in a sealed container, which would explain why there were no trails of dripping blood. Olofsson stifled a gag. These few elements, combined with the best profiling data, tell me a lot of things, the profiler continued. They suggest that our killer is someone who is well integrated in society, is of above-average intelligence, is in a relationship, and perhaps even has a family, and is employed. They choose strangers as their victims, people living nowhere near the killer's home. This profiling work suggests we're dealing with a serial killer who has struck before, and should have a history in the judicial system. Emily returned to the table, sat back in her chair, and crossed her legs before turning to address her audience. However, there are 2 elements inconsistent with this profile. First, the killer attacked Kerstin and Louise in a frenzied manner, stabbing them far more times than was necessary to kill them. Second, the bodies were left at the crime scene. These elements would tend to suggest an unplanned or unexpected aspect to these murders, which contradicts the profile I just explained. "Oh, that really helps, doesn't it?" Olofsson scoffed. "And where does Alienor fit into all of this?" he asked as he poured himself another coffee. "Do you think she might still be in danger?" Emily shook her head. "I said earlier I would get back to Kerstin. Unlike her husband and her daughter, Kerstin Lindberga's body wasn't covered up, and her bed wasn't remade, so the crime scene wasn't altered. That wasn't something the killer forgot or didn't have time to do. Rather, it was intended to punish. Kerstin was the main target of this massacre. The killer clearly expressed a desire and a need to chastise the mother and wife in the family. Or, rather, as you say, to chastise the bad mother and the bad wife, Olafsson deduced. Right, Bergström breathed, at the end of a weary sigh. Let's keep looking into the clinic and digging away at the Lindberg's pasts. We'll wait and see if Interpol turns up anything interesting.
Wednesday, the 22nd of February, 2012. Nino gives me a hug with my herbal tea. Our eyes meet, then avoid each other. Nothing has really helped since I finished my last round of therapy 5 years ago. I still feel like I'm going round in circles. I still dwell on the same memories, the same anxiety, the same anger, and I can't bring myself to move on. I stay fixated on the facts that I carry with me wherever I go, like travel companions. I don't know how to talk about anything else. Nino sits me on the bidet and pulls down my incontinence pants. I don't know how he can stand being by my side day in, day out, listening to me ramble on about the same old things. I know it's an obsession, this kind of bulimia I have about that chapter in my life, but I can't stop myself from talking about it, regurgitating, chewing, swallowing it again, but never, ever digesting it. Come, Nino says. I can hear the bathwater running. I don't really feel like it. You have to wash, please. I don't want to have to manhandle you. Do I smell? With downcast eyes, he nods. It's true. I do smell. But I've lost so much over all these years. Much more than myself. Hey, he says, as he helps me into the bath. You didn't say a word over dinner. He could have replicated my monologue without me opening my mouth. Starting with my funny turn in the church on the day of the baptism 22 years ago. Then followed by that drastic change, when what was such a simple, serene pleasure turned into the nightmare that has tormented me and torn me away from the people I love. That's what I would have talked about at dinner. For the umpteenth time. It's been 18 years since I've seen my grandson, or my daughter, for that matter. I forgot to give my little man his bottles. Not during the daytime, but at night. I still managed to get him back to sleep, though. Then I forgot to give him his morning feed, and our little man became dehydrated. I don't know how I could have not thought about it, not remembered. After that incident, my daughter never left me alone with him again. She started to pull away from me. Daily visits became weekly. Then even our Sunday dinners grew further apart, until it was just Nino and me on Sundays. I yelp. The water is too hot. I think addiction is a better word, really, because I just can't stay away from the subject, from the rape, the rapist, and the rest of it. I always find a way to bring him back to the conversation, invite him to join us. I know I'm wallowing in the past, but I simply cannot detach myself from it or change my approach to it, which is even more upsetting. I've become as dependent on revisiting my memories as an alcoholic nursing on a bottle. I realize I haven't replied to my Nino, but he's already turning up the volume on the plasma TV he installed in the bathroom to keep me in the bath. The news is on. He sits beside me, on the edge of the bath, takes my hand and kisses it, still avoiding eye contact. Perhaps he doesn't want to lay eyes on the woman I've become. Perhaps he's trying to remember the woman who filled his life before all of this. Or maybe he just wants to watch the news in peace. Nino inches the volume higher, as if he can hear me thinking, dwelling. I hear the voice before I see the images. I release a whimper. Nino doesn't even turn around. He knows why I've cried out. He's listening to the journalist commenting on the photos streaming in a loop on the screen, and the video with that voice exchanging a few words with Franco. The voice that sends shivers through my body and soul.
Diplomat Hotel, Stockholm, Tuesday, the 6th of December, 2016, 5 p.m. It was hours since the blanket of night had settled over Stockholm, yet the darkness was tinged with color. What was black took on a bluish hue in the snow, and the lights from the buildings shimmered yellow in the sea. Alexei was sitting in the bar of the Diplomat Hotel in Östermalm, the swanky part of the city. The hotel stood in pride of place on Strandvägen, a grand waterfront boulevard that stretched from west to east, connecting the hub of Nybroplan Square to the Nobel Park along an arm of land that reached out to embrace the Baltic Sea. She couldn't help but gaze out at the strip of frozen water surrounded by the quaysides. No matter where you went in Stockholm, the water was always whispering sweet nothings to the land and the stones of the wharves. She swirled the wine around her glass before she took a sip. White was not her preferred color. Still, she had succumbed to the waitress's insistence that she should try a glass of something that would make any red pale in comparison. This Burgundy certainly was exquisite, Alexei had to admit, but nowhere near as satisfying as a full-bodied red. Emily came in and took a seat across from her. "I ordered one for you too," Alexei said, sliding a second glass to Emily. Emily swished the wine around a couple of times and took a sip. After their meeting that morning, Emily and Christian had started to contact patients of the Lindbergh Clinic whose treatments had failed. Most had not been keen to talk about their experiences, and were even less inclined to explain their whereabouts at the time of the murders. Only one woman had agreed to see them, Lydia Olsson, a Dane who lived in Stockholm. She had told Emily she would be happy to meet with her that very evening. Emily and Alexei had jumped on a train to the capital city later that morning, leaving Bergström and Olofsson to keep combing through the patient files, much to Christian's horror, who was worried they'd be at it all night. Just an hour ago, Emily and Alexei had checked into the hotel where Lydia Olsson had arranged to meet them. "Emily Roy?" Emily looked up to see a smiling young woman extending a friendly hand over the tops of their wine glasses. "Good evening. I'm Lydia Olsson." "Hello, Lydia. Thank you for agreeing to meet with us," Emily replied, clasping the woman's hand in hers. "Thank you for coming all this way. My office is just over the road, so this place couldn't be handier. You've traveled from Falkenberg, haven't you?" She looked from Emily to Alexei, her warm, generous smile creasing the corners of her eyes. Emily nodded and returned a gentle, maternal smile. "This is Alexei Castells, the colleague I mentioned on the phone." "Can we offer you a drink?" Alexei asked after a brief handshake. Lydia's straight, dark bob brushed softly against her jawbone. A few stray locks briefly veiled her light eyes. She flicked them away. "I'd love a glass of what you're having, thanks," she replied, taking off her coat. Alexei ordered a third glass of Burgundy. The waitress beamed a triumphant smile. Sure, she had succeeded in converting Alexei from red to white. What terrible news. I can't believe such a horrific thing could have happened to the Lindberghs, Lydia said as she sat down. I dread to think what it must be like for their children to come to terms with something like that. My God, it's horrible. They have another daughter and a son, don't they? Emily nodded. Lydia briefly scrunched up her eyebrows, then smoothed them with the tips of her fingers. What do you want me to talk about exactly? Our journey through the desert lasted for years, she joked, so we might be here all night. She took a glass from the waitress's outstretched hand. About your experience at the clinic, and about the Lindberghs, if you ever met them. Lydia's gaze wandered through the window to the quayside and its dusting of snow before falling on the table in front of them. She slid the 3 glasses away from each other, as if to make room for her memories. I met Göran, Kerstin, and their daughter Louise at a talk about infertility. That man was like a magnet. He had such a presence. He certainly had that effect on his wife, in any case. She was like his shadow, following him everywhere with this strange sort of devotion. How do you mean, strange? Lydia shook her head. Her hair rippled in time. A wrinkle formed at the bridge of her nose. It's hard to explain. It was as if he was the only reason she existed. I don't know. It's just a feeling. They were both charming, and that's the reason we chose their clinic. And you met Louise Lindbergh too? Yes. As a matter of fact, she was the one who came over to talk to me. She had a talent, or rather, a gift for putting people at ease. She made people feel not just heard, but special, as if her whole world revolved around them. She was an exceptionally good listener. Lydia savored the wine on her lips, never taking her eyes off the glass as she set it down again. My husband, Terence, and I, we're one of those infertile couples whose infertility is, how shall I put it, unexplained. Well, that's not entirely true, because my husband's sperm aren't the strongest swimmers, but in vitro fertilization should have worked. That wasn't the case, though. Over the course of 3 years, I had 9 treatments that all ended in failure. Month after month, you live in hope. But the longer you try, the harder that hope is to find. You spend all your time listening to your body. It's like you're constantly eavesdropping on a stranger. You end up feeling reduced to a cluster of cells, not a woman. You lose every bit of sex drive, and you're guided only by the desire to reproduce. It's like you're just a womb on legs, you know? Lydia shifted in her chair. She wasn't smiling anymore. Our relationship started to fall apart. I found myself resenting my husband for standing in the way of me becoming a mother. And it pained him to see me going through all that torture because of his physical shortcomings. It made him feel so inadequate. We both ended up cheating on each other. She downed a long swig of wine and stared at the table. And then I got pregnant. By the other man I was seeing. Lydia hunched her shoulders, gazing at her fingers as she ran them along the grain in the wood. Right then, at that moment, when I told him another man had given me what he couldn't, and his reaction. Lydia pursed her lips and tightened her grip on the wineglass. He put his hand on my belly. There's life inside you. That's what he said. He rubbed my belly, and he told me he wanted to be a father to that child. Her chest swelled with a sigh of relief. I know how strange that sounds. You can think what you like, but it seemed to us that it would be even more bizarre and unnatural to go through a sperm donor. One of my friends, Melinda Gorp, and her wife Vera, had some unbelievable and frankly inhumane experiences with sperm banks. Most of them are based in Denmark, where I come from, actually. Melinda was already pregnant when she got an email to notify them that I don't know how many babies fathered by the donor they had chosen were born with serious heart problems. I mean, hearing about something like that by email, can you imagine? Basically, a message telling you the child you're carrying is doomed. And then they had a ridiculous email from another sperm bank announcing a Boxing Day sale. 2 vials for the price of 1. My God, Alexei muttered. I'm not joking. Most of these places treat their clients as if they're umming and awing over 2 jars of jam on the supermarket shelf, whereas they're actually choosing the progenitor of their child, making decisions about their genetic heritage. It's tragic. Tragic and completely insane. Anyway, Lydia smiled, a dejected, weary smile. I lost the baby. But, strangely, it gave us, the strength to carry on, I suppose. And so, we decided to try IVF again, for the 10th time. And I got pregnant on the first cycle. Now our little girl Ella is 4. Oh, that's wonderful. Congratulations, Lydia. I suppose you could say we needed to take a break for a while. The same thing happened with Vera and Melinda. After they took a break, Melinda got pregnant on the first try, with twins. Which clinic did you go through? What do you mean? When you had your daughter? Lydia gave them a look of surprise. The Lindbergh Clinic, of course. The last thing I wanted to do was start again with all the tests we did when we first tried the treatment. As far as we were concerned, the clinic didn't do anything wrong, so there was no need to go elsewhere. Vera and Melinda stayed with the Lindbergh Clinic too. It really is an excellent facility. But we found your name on the list of patients who hadn't managed to conceive. That's probably because I was registered under my husband's name, Roberts, when I got pregnant, whereas I went by my maiden name, Lydia Olsson, the first 9 times. I still can't get used to it. I keep introducing myself as Lydia Olsson. I never really made a conscious decision to change my name, but I took the leap when we started trying again, so we'd all have the same last name when our child was born. I thought it would be a symbolic way to lay the foundations for our family. The clinic must have forgotten to merge the 2 vials. Forgotten? Certainly not, Alexei thought. Diplomat Hotel, Stockholm, Tuesday, the 6th of December, 2016, 9 p.m. Alexei slipped on the hotel bathrobe and opened the door. A young woman wearing a crown of blonde braids stood in the corridor, holding a room service tray. Bonsoir, Madame Castells. Here's the dinner you ordered, she announced in French, and 2 dimples dented her milky white cheeks. Would you like me to put the tray on the desk or the coffee table? On the bed, please. The young woman blushed. She looked like one of the porcelain dolls Alexei used to collect as a child. The only thing missing was a frilly satin dress and shiny shoes. Your French is excellent, Estelle, Alexei said, having glanced at the name on the badge pinned to the woman's breast. The young woman smiled, and her blue eyes sparkled with a glint of childlike joy. Thank you. I'm flattered, she replied, smoothing the bedspread flat around the tray. Have a lovely evening, Madame Castells. She made her way towards the door, but turned around at the last second. I don't mean to bother you, but I just wanted to let you know I loved your books. I devoured them, in fact. The Ebner affair really resonated with me, because I used to spend summers in Falkenberg when I was growing up, she explained, dropping the G the way a local would, and making the word dance. And I'm sorry for your friend Linnea Blix. A wave of goosebumps spread across Alexi's skin. She still found it touching to meet her readers, and even more so when they rekindled the memory of Linnea. You're very sweet. Thank you so much. It means a lot to hear that Linnea lives on in the thoughts of people like you. Estelle smiled at her and walked out of the room, leaving Alexei in the glow of the happiness her few words had ignited. Alexei sat down on the edge of the bed, her mind filled with thoughts of Linnea and the imprint her friend had made on her life. On the morning of their wedding, she and Stellan were planning to lay a wreath at Torsvik Småbåtshamn in Olofsbo, the tiny marina where Linnea's body had been found 2 years earlier. Alexei pulled her laptop towards her. Propping the computer on her legs, she opened the document containing the list of patient files from the clinic with one hand and dug into her cheese board with the other. There were thousands of names and stories on the list. They had already started singling out those patients whose treatments had failed. Alexei wondered whether she should take a different approach, though, and look at the treatments that did succeed. The unexpected success stories, the sudden ones, like Lydia Roberts and Melinda Gorb. There was a knock at the door. Alexei finished chewing her chunk of bread before getting up to open it. Stellan was standing in the corridor, suitcase in hand. "Babe!" Alexei gasped, more concerned than surprised. "But I thought, weren't we going to see each other tomorrow morning? Are you—" "I needed to see you." "What's wrong? Is everything okay? What's happened? Did something happen with your job? And you? Are you all right?" Stellan closed the door behind him. "Mado, what are you doing inside Alexei's body?" he joked, wheeling his suitcase into the space beside the luggage rack. "Everything's fine. I just wanted to see you. Needed to see you." He cupped her cheeks in his hands. "Oh, Alexei, my Iskling." He kissed her gently, tracing the edges of her mouth with his lips. "My wife." He paused and gazed at her with tender, eager eyes. "You're going to be my wife." He relished the possessive pronoun with passion and pride. Alexei smiled between 2 kisses. Stellan teased her dressing gown open. Still pressing his mouth to hers, he let his fingers wander down her hips, between her thighs. Alexei moaned. She fumbled a few steps back against the door, yielding to the warmth of Stellan's tongue and fumbling to unbutton his jeans. He pressed himself tightly against her, and Alexei felt her legs quivering as he lifted her up. "My wife," he whispered in her ear.
La Virgen de los Desamparados Orphanage, Madrid, Tuesday, the 10th of April, 1951. Gordi reached for La Una's hand on one side and Reme's on the other. Petrified, La Dos was clinging to her sister. Gordi knew the routine by heart now. All hold hands in a circle around whichever of the girls had wet the bed that night and loudly chant "Pissy Pants" and "Filthy Wench" in unison. It wasn't like that in the other orphanage. Gordi figured everywhere had its own methods. In the old place, the nuns had a different way of dealing with the children who had wet the bed. They used to lock them in a cage in a dark room and leave them there until they stopped crying and screaming. Sister Fernanda set the name-calling in motion, and the chorus of girls followed suit. Dulce was the one in the middle of the circle again. Rooted to the spot, she was staring at the floor, trying to shut everything and everyone out, trying to hide from all these horrible words thrown around by her friends. They didn't mean any of the words, of course, but they still repeated them harshly enough to ward off the dreaded floggings. A few weeks earlier, Gordi had come up with an idea. Since Dulce had such a hard time staying dry at night, she suggested she might offer to wash the blood from the nuns' soiled menstrual towels. Perhaps then they would go a bit easier on her and stop banishing her to the pissy pants attic. Dulce shivered when she talked about that place. First they would flog her with stinging nettles, or, if Sister Fernanda had anything to do with it, burn her with a candle, right there, between her legs. Then they would shut her in the dark. Dulce had spent a whole afternoon cleaning their soiled towels, plunging her hands into ice-cold water to rub the blood away. A few nights later, she had wet the bed again. In the morning, Sister Fernanda had flogged her with her braid of leather belts in front of all the other girls. She had made them all watch as Dulce bent double on her bed, her eyes full of pain and her body writhing with every blow as blood streamed down her back and buttocks. Sister Fernanda's eyes had blazed with glee, as they did every time she beat the girls. She had forced them all to listen to Dulce's pleas and her screams of agony before delivering the same litany and banishing her to the dark, her buttocks smarting from the blows and her privates swollen and puffy from the stinging nettles. Gordi squeezed Reme's and Launa's hands hard. They had no choice but to do what they were told, and cling to each other as tightly as Sister Fernanda's leather belt whip was braided. Gordi's mind was made up. The next day, she would go to the chapel. She would kneel down, say her prayers, and tell Jesus he was a murderer.
This is the end of CD 4. The book continues on CD 5. CD 5.
Grand Hotel, Falkenberg. Wednesday, the 7th of December, 2016, 8 p.m. Alienor took a bite of the last slice of her pineapple pizza and put the rest back in the box, wiping her hands on the paper napkin. As her fingers touched the computer keyboard, she thought of her father. He couldn't stand paper napkins. He always thought cloth ones were better. Just like handkerchiefs were better than tissues. Whatever were they going to do with all Göran's cotton handkerchiefs? Olofsson had brought Louise's laptop to her at the hotel that morning. Alienor hadn't left her room all day. She had only changed positions, moving to the bed at 7:30 to work with the computer on her knees and her dinner on the duvet beside her. Alienor had never been asked to sort through the contents of a computer before. It was a colossal undertaking. She had soon developed a way to stay focused. She was alternately going through emails, files, and photos, dividing everything by year and going back a decade to 2006. Alienor would never have expected that her sister, who was always so impeccably methodical, she used to organize her underwear by color and books by their author, would have such an unstructured email inbox. It looked like it had never been organized. Louise's 2 email accounts, one Yahoo address and another connected to their parents' clinic from when she worked there, were both set up in Outlook. She only had 3 folders entitled Travel, Bills, and Clinic. All the remaining messages were jumbled together in her inbox, right down to the very last, which was one of those insufferable chain emails from one of Louise's friends, promising great fortune in exchange for forwarding the chain, which she had duly done several hours before she died. Judging by her deleted items folder, she only ever got rid of spam and newsletters and kept everything else. Alienor took a long swig of Romlosa mineral water. She had just finished going through everything from 2011. It had been both fruitful and exasperating to go through every document in every folder and look at every single photo. Seeing Louise time and time again made Aliénor want to dig into her chest with her bare hands and tear her heart out. But at the same time, she would have spent all day cycling through those photos, just to feel the bright spark of joy, even if it only lasted a split second, when Louise appeared on the screen, flooding her mind with happy thoughts and setting her heart aglow. But as the sentiment passed, it felt like a bubble had burst, leaving the horror and emptiness behind. Aliénor had to keep bringing her mind back to the task at hand. This was her mechanism for coping with the panic and the pain. Click on the next email, read the next line, draw the next conclusion. That said, she was only doing a quick scan of each of Louise's emails at this point. She had created a folder in Outlook where she dragged any messages that jumped out at her because of their subject, sender, or recipient. She would read the messages properly the second time around. Aliénor closed the lid of the pizza box and made a start on her tiramisu. It was time to tackle 2012 now. With the spoon still in her mouth, she opened the folder containing Louise's photos. She only found 3 albums. One entitled Ko-Fi-Fi from January, another named Anna W. Wedding from October, and one more labeled New Year's. Aliénor frowned. There were 4 times fewer albums in 2012 than any of the previous years she had sorted through. She quickly checked to make sure Louise hadn't filed her photos under the wrong year, but everything seemed to be in order. Aliénor spooned some more tiramisu into her mouth and opened the Ko-Fi-Fi album. Her sister had gone on a girls' trip to Thailand with her friends and taken the usual snapshots, beaches, parties, and local delicacies. Louise was radiant. In October that year, she had been to the wedding of a friend from university, Anna. That album only contained a few photos of the couple in church, together with their children, the youngest of which must have been around 5. There were no photos of Louise herself. The New Year's album was similarly sparse, showing just a dozen or so photos of a group having dinner and then dancing. Louise was absent from these photos, too. Aliénor set her spoon down and moved on again, to Louise's emails. Around the 21st of March, her sister had started to send fewer and fewer messages. Then, from the 17th of June, most of the emails in her work inbox had gone unanswered. That had led to a message from their father telling her to come and see him in his office, followed by another 2 days later asking her why she wasn't at the Danish conference, where she was supposed to be representing the clinic. Louise had not responded, which had provoked a flurry of furious emails from Göran. Aliénor closed her eyes. Something had shaken Louise enough to make her neglect her work and forget about a conference in Denmark. Inconceivable behavior for someone as diligent and conscientious as her. 2012. Aliénor tapped at her eyebrows. Had something happened in their family that year? Nothing significant, otherwise she would remember. The last family drama she could recall was 18 years ago, when her autism came to light. Could Louise have fallen seriously ill? Aliénor shook the thought out of her mind. Back then, Louise was working with her parents and brother Leopold. They used to see each other 6 days a week because they always had Sunday lunch together as a family. If Louise had lost weight or seemed frail, Göran, Kerstin, Leopold, and Gerda would have noticed. And so would I, Aliénor thought. I would have noticed the changes in her face. Sickness had a tendency to yellow, hollow, and shrivel a person. It went hand in hand with sadness, draining the face and withering the gaze. Aliénor looked up at the window and cast her eyes towards the arches of the Toulbrunn Bridge, straddling the Etran River. A bridge older than the Royal Opera House at the Palace of Versailles. Louise had told her, the first time they'd come here to fish for salmon. Aliénor remembered the 2 green benches down below, by the river, perched on a narrow strip of land splashed by the current. There they had leaned back and enjoyed a punnet of fat strawberries, the sweet red juice coating their lips, running down their chins as they squinted in the sun. Aliénor had kept the hook as a souvenir. As the memory flooded back to her, Aliénor swiftly closed the screen of the laptop. Yes, of course, the hook. She had kept the hook. Aliénor jumped out of bed and donned her boots and her down jacket. She pulled a hat over her ears, grabbed her bag, and left the hotel room with her phone glued to her ear. Now she knew where to look.
La Virgen de los Desamparados Orphanage, Madrid, Friday the 15th of August, 1952. Gordy had seen Father Murillo doing his rounds in the dormitory during the night, without his leather belt whip this time. But she was far too thirsty to wait until the next morning, so she got up and went to drink from the toilets. After a year and a half of wandering these hallways, she knew her way around with her eyes closed. It had been a good day for the 5 of them. Gordy had asked them to talk about their parents. She wanted to know what it was like to have a mother, a father, a grandmother. She wondered what it must feel like to exist in someone else's world and see your life play out in their eyes. Reme told the others how her father would rub her and her brother with tobacco when they went to see him in prison before he died, so that his smell would linger with them when they went home. La Una and La Dos showed them their shoes with the names of their parents written on the soles. Dulce talked about her mother and the braids she would wrap around her head like a crown, the salty smell of her hair, and the way she would always snort a little bit after she laughed. Gordy had listened and tried to conjure up memories of her own, but nothing came to her. She'd had trouble falling asleep that night. When she finally did, she soon woke, feeling as if she had thorns in her throat. So she slipped out of bed and went to the toilets. From the corridor, she heard some strange noises. Whispering, hissing, rustling. As she inched closer to where the sounds were coming from, she saw Father Murillo first, from behind. He was grunting and rocking back and forth on his knees, his cassock covering his legs, brushing against the floor. He kept going like that for a while, until he shuddered and gasped a funny, muffled sort of cry. As he stood up and shuffled away, Gordy saw the naked body huddled in silence on the floor, curled up tightly like a grub in the sudden silence. The body started to shake, and only when it unfurled from a fetal position did Gordy see who it belonged to. La Una pulled her nightdress back on, slipped a towel into her underwear, and tottered towards Gordy without noticing her in the doorway. As she drew closer, Gordy threw her arms around her. "Good heavens! Whatever did Father Murillo do to you? Are you hurt?" "Shh!" La Una said. "Don't worry about me, my sweet Gordy. It's all right. Come on. Let's get back to bed," she whispered, planting a kiss on the top of her head. Gordy started to sob. She didn't understand why this wave of sadness had washed over her, but she cupped her hands over her mouth to stifle it. La Una gazed softly at her face and brushed away the few locks of hair the tears had matted to her cheeks. "Listen, my sweet Gordy. If Father Murillo comes to see you during the night, and if he brings you here, try to think about your mother, all right? Think about her. Somewhere in your mind, you must have some fragments of memories of your mother.
take those pieces, stick them back together, and think about her."
Gordy tried, but no images came to her mind. Nothing but the immeasurable heartache that made her want to go to sleep and never wake up again.
"I can't. What do you see in your mind when you feel the warmth right there in your chest?"
she asked, placing her hand on Gordy's heart. Gordy thought for a moment, and she saw the sea.
"Your smile, Launa. The smile you gave me when I first came here. If I had a mother, she would smile at me the way you do, with the same kind of light in her eyes. Well, think about me then, my sweet Gordy, and the smile I draw on my face for you."
Falkenbergia, home of the Lindbergs. Wednesday, the 7th of December, 2016, 11 p.m. Alienor went up the outdoor staircase to Yarda's attic. She walked straight through the apartment without turning on the light, and then went down the stairs into the main house. She stopped on the upstairs landing and flicked the switch, filling the hallway with light. White walls, pale floorboards, and black fingerprint powder. No streaks of red staining the floor, and no spatters arcing across the ceiling. Only black and white. Alienor leaned against the door on her left, Louise's bedroom door, and gave a loud sigh. She closed her eyes and listened to the echoes of her short breaths and pounding pulse. Alienor could feel her heart quaking in her chest. Or maybe it was her whole body that was shaking. As she made her way to the family home, Alienor had thought about nothing more than going into Louise's room, lying down on her bed and feeling her spirit, to breathe her scent and conjure up her presence, to be with her. And by touching her clothes, leafing through her books, looking at her photos and stirring her sister's world to life, Alienor would be able to hear her voice. That wasn't how it worked, though. Because Leopold was right. Now the only thing left in that house was death. She shouldn't have come here alone, she thought. Emily could have come with her, or Yarda, or Alexei. On Monday, she had sensed a certain closeness with Alexei, as if they were grieving together and shedding the same tears. That was strange, because Alexei didn't know Louise or their parents. Alienor had thought about seeking comfort in her arms. The idea had come to her spontaneously, so that meant it was an urge. She was sure that Alexei would have embraced her with open arms. She had pictured Alexei resting her cheek on the top of her head, sweeping a few stray locks of hair from her face, and hugging her tight. All of that had run through her mind in a matter of seconds. Maybe it was because Alexei reminded her of Louise. They had the same gentle nature and air of determination. Alienor lifted her hand from the door and crossed the hallway to her own room. When she turned on the light, it struck her that it was no longer her room. It was the room where her sister had died. She found the sight of the blood-soaked mattress sickening. The grief felt like an arrow piercing her heart. Alienor groaned and bent double. Gripping her thighs in her hands, her arms as stiff as sticks, she sobbed a fit of heavy tears that sent shudders through her chest. The tears stretched out into a cry of rage, a battle cry. Someone had killed Louise. Someone had taken Louise away from her. Anger pulsed through her limbs and gave her the strength to stand up again. Someone had killed Louise. Someone had taken Louise away from her. Alienor pulled the step stool out from between her desk and the wall. She slid it in front of her wardrobe, climbed to the top step, and stood on tiptoe to open the narrow cupboard above. She pulled out 2 cardboard boxes and stepped down carefully. Placing the boxes on the floor, she removed the lid from one of them. The box contained around a dozen thick journals, all stacked up against each other. Each journal had a year written on the spine. Louise had encouraged her to start writing these journals just before she hit puberty, to set goals for herself every year, figure out strategies for achieving them, and keep track of her thoughts and triumphs. In the beginning, Aliénor had balked at the idea of writing in her journal, so Louise had helped her make it part of her routine. After brushing her teeth at night and before reading in bed, Aliénor would take 5 minutes to reflect on her day and make a note of her feelings and accomplishments, with her sister sitting on the end of her bed to watch over her. Little by little, Aliénor had found that reading over what she had written gave her such great pleasure. She came to enjoy filling the pages and devoted more and more time to the endeavor. Aliénor pulled out the journal dated 2012, sat down on the floor with her back against the wardrobe, and started to read. If she had noticed something strange or unusual about her sister, or if she or her family had experienced anything disturbing, there would be a note of it in here. 2012 was the year she had read Bonjour Tristesse in French. It was also the year she had finally seen the film Snabbakash, starring Joel Shinneman. The English title was Easy Money, she recalled. Aliénor tried to turn to the next page, but the sheet only bent a little, as if it were suddenly too stiff and made from heavier weight paper. She pinched the folded down corner between her thumb and middle finger and turned the page. Her eyebrows crinkled to a frown, and she gasped, her mouth half open with surprise for a few short seconds. Then Aliénor closed her journal with shaking hands. Falkenberg Police Station, Thursday, the 8th of December, 2016, 7 a.m. Olafsson stifled a yawn with his fist. Talk about harsh. Having a team meeting at 7 in the morning. It didn't help that he'd still been awake at 4. He really had to get a good night's sleep by himself. Otherwise he'd crash and burn. He just couldn't get enough of Mona, though. And that was really weird. He'd never felt anything like it before. Such an insatiable need to be with a woman. He spent his days trying to take his mind off her, trying to stop the images of the nights they spent together from flashing before his eyes. He could spend his every waking minute thinking about her, seeing her in the throes of passion, watching her smile, laugh, eat, and even sleep. Yes, sleep. He loved the pouty crease of her lips and the little wrinkle that appeared between her eyes. For fuck's sake, why was she making him go all soppy? Soft in the head, but still hard in the... Christian! Bergström's voice crashed like cymbals in his ear. Olafsson blinked himself back to reality. Yes, what, boss? For the 3rd time. Coffee? Sure. Nights are for sleeping, Olafsson. The commissioner thundered as he filled his subordinate's mug. Christian sipped at the steaming coffee. Emily and Alexei were sitting at the conference table, each turning their laptop on. He hadn't even heard them come in. Right. Well, Interpol got back to us, Bergström began, closing his eyes and pinching the bridge of his nose. They don't have anything that fits with our case. Emily frowned. Well, not technically nothing. They did send us a few leads, the commissioner clarified, seeing Emily's reaction. but nothing that I feel speaks to our perp's profile. Emily, I uploaded their report to our internal server so you can read it. Christian, where are you with the list of patients whose treatments didn't pan out? I've been having a hell of a time checking their alibis. It's taking forever to get anywhere. Bergström turned to Emily and Alexei. Ladies, what's new with your theory about the sudden and miraculous MAR success stories? That's Alexei's theory, Emily corrected. In spite of the headache making his forehead throb, Bergström had to fight a smile. Those words could just as easily have come from Alionor's lips. For a brief moment, Alexei placed her hand on Emily's and flashed her an even briefer smile. She knew her appreciation would only glance off the profiler's skin. Subtle and stealthy was the only way to avoid ruffling her feathers. The commissioner was treated to a longer smile. We focused on what I would say were the most desperate cases, Alexei explained. In other words, patients who got pregnant after 5 or more tries. We compared the treatments that failed with those that succeeded by examining 4 aspects of data: the drugs used and the quality of the eggs, the sperm, and the embryo. Well, that must have been a hoot, Olofsson scoffed. Tell me about it. Anyway, we waded our way through no further than 122 files yesterday, starting with Lydia Olsen Roberts and her friend Melinda Gorp, and we think we're on to something. Even though there was no change in the quality of the eggs and sperm, the quality of the embryos improved dramatically to reach an optimal level. And the treatment itself wasn't modified in any way, Bergström asked. Oh, it was. Wait a second. What are you suggesting? Alexei paused and swallowed. Her theory made her feel sick to her stomach. That it wasn't their own embryos that were implanted. What I mean is that these women didn't realize it, but they were carrying someone else's child. A dense, heavy silence descended on the room, muffling the sounds of the hustle and bustle elsewhere in the station that crept its way through the thin walls. Hey! Alionor was standing in the doorway to the conference room, looking pale and disheveled. No one had heard the double doors creak open. I haven't slept, she announced, her voice raw with fatigue. We'd never have guessed, Google, Olofsson quipped, taking a sip of cold coffee. I found something else. On Louise's computer? Emily asked. No, in my room. With a subtle nod, the profiler urged Alionor to continue. Alionor moistened her chapped lips. I found a SIM card in a small envelope taped into my journal for 2012, on the page for the 1st of June. Bergström turned to Emily, wondering whether she was as lost as he was. Alionor unbuckled her messenger bag and pulled out a spiral-bound notebook protected by a freezer bag. Emily reached into her own backpack for a pair of latex gloves. She tore open the protective plastic packaging and pulled the gloves on. And you didn't open the envelope? She asked, taking the journal from Alionor. Alionor shook her head. Emily unzipped the plastic freezer bag and took the journal out. She flipped through until she got to the page for the 1st of June, 2012. A tiny envelope made of tracing paper, the same kind that individual safety razor blades came wrapped in, was taped to the middle of the page. Christian, go and find me a phone and a Stanley knife in— Yep, I'm on it, boss, the detective replied and hurried out of the room. Only Louise could have put that there, Alionor murmured, as if the thought were meant for her sister's ears alone. What makes you say that? Bergström asked, staring at the journal. Louise was the one who got me into writing these journals every day. Neither of my parents nor Yarda knew about them. Maybe Yarda did, actually, since she was the one who cleaned my room. but I never saw her clean inside my cupboards. I suppose she could have peeked inside, but I doubt it. Only Louise and I knew that these journals existed and what was in them. That's why I think she put the SIM card in there.
What made you think to look in your diary?
It's not a diary. It's a journal.
All right, Alienor. I understand.
It was the Toulbrunn Bridge, the one beside the hotel. Bergström shook his head.
What do you mean?
You asked what made me look in my journal, Commissioner. The idea came to me when I saw the bridge from my hotel room. It made me think about the first time Louise took me fishing, and the hook I kept as a souvenir, and what I had written about that day in my journal. I was in the middle of going through Louise's inbox, and I realized that her behavior really started to change in the second quarter of 2012. She let her work and personal emails go unanswered or replied very late. She failed to report for work without telling my father, which made him furious, and she forgot her friends' birthdays, that sort of thing. And so I wondered what might have happened in her life, or ours. Our families, I mean, for her to behave like that. Otherwise, Louise was always such a responsible, upstanding, and loyal person. Something serious, or at least very troubling, must have happened in her life for her to neglect her responsibilities as a daughter, friend, and employee.
Alienor pressed her dry lips together, tilted her head back to stretch her neck, and swallowed.
But 2012 was 4 years ago, and I couldn't remember what had happened that year, so I thought about my journals. I figured I might have made a note of something that probably seemed insignificant at the time, but would make perfect sense now, and I went home to look through them. When I opened my journal from 2012, that's what I found. Then I spent the night reading the rest of the emails from that time in their entirety, trying to uncover more specific details, but I couldn't find anything.
Were you in the habit of rereading your journals from time to time? Emily asked.
No, not before now.
What about your sister?
She never read them, so no, she never reread them either.
But she knew where you kept them?
Yes, Alienor admitted with a nod.
The double doors swung wide open, and Olofsson hurried back into the conference room. Emily took the Stanley knife from the detective's outstretched hand. Delicately, she sliced through the few millimeters of adhesive tape holding the flap of the envelope down, and extricated the SIM card. She inserted it into the slot of the phone that Olofsson had just plugged in to charge, and passed the phone to him. The detective turned the phone on as Bergström, Emily, and Alexei all huddled around him. Alienor sat down on the chair closest to the double doors, crossing her fingers and placing her hands on her thighs. The touch screen only contained a few app icons. Olofsson opened the list of contacts first. It was empty, as was the messages folder. He moved on to the call log, which showed no incoming calls, but did list around a dozen outgoing calls over a 4-month period from May to September of 2012. The calls were made to only 3 numbers:
Norway, Spain, and Spain again, Bergström observed, pointing at each of the numbers in turn.
Alienor, do you want to come and take a look at these?
I don't need to. My sister never talked to me about anyone who lived in Norway or Spain.
Would you like some water, Alienor, or maybe a bite to eat? Alexei offered, reaching a hand across the table as if to touch her. Alienor shook her head weakly.
You're very pale, Alienor, Alexei persisted, pouring her a glass of water. Because I haven't slept.
Alexei stood up and set the glass down in front of Alienor.
Drink it, please, Emily insisted.
Alienor acquiesced and gulped the water down greedily. She kept the glass cradled in her hand and stared at the commissioner. Bergström pulled the conference room phone towards him pressed the internal speakerphone button and dialed the Norwegian number. The line disconnected straight away. He tried again, and the same thing happened. Helvete, he hissed. Staring at the phone, he took a deep breath and moved on to the next number. The phone rang 5 times before it was picked up by an answer phone. The robotic voice repeated the number he had just dialed and ended with a beep. Buenos dias, Bergström began in a very Germanic-sounding Spanish. Soy el comisionario Lennart Bergström de la Policía de Falkenberg en Suecia. Le contactamos en relación con una encuesta. Por favor, llámenos urgentemente al 004677114140. He hung up and dialed the third and final number. After 3 rings, the call went to voicemail. Hola, sí es Paula, pero no estoy. Déjame un mensaje si quieres y te llamaré cuando pueda. Besos. Taken by surprise, Bergström paused for a second or two before repeating the same message, this time mentioning the name he had just heard on the voicemail greeting. He hung up and immediately made an internal call to initiate a search on the Swedish number associated with the SIM card, as well as the 3 numbers he had just dialed. Well, apparently I'm the only uncultured person here, but it's not the end of the world, Olofsson joked once Bergström had finished his conversation. Can someone translate me what Penelope Cruz just said on the phone, please? Penelope Cruz's name is Paula, Alexei grinned, and that's the only information she gave in her voicemail greeting. Lennart just explained that he was calling about an ongoing investigation, and he said to please call the Falkenberg police urgently. Well, that's a real help, isn't it? Olofsson snorted, rubbing his eyes. Sweden, Norway, Spain, Paula. For fuck's sake, Google, you've really opened Pandora's box for us, haven't you? Alienor stood up, took off her parka, and draped it over the back of her chair. For once, Christian, I agree with you, she said, as she sat down again.
La Virgen de los Desamparados Orphanage, Madrid, Sunday the 17th of August, 1952. The summer sun was choking everything. The parched earth smoked, cracked, and crunched underfoot. The air was stifling everywhere, except for here, within the stone walls of the chapel, where it was as dark as night, but at least you could breathe. Life was always good when Christ was near, Sister Fernanda would have said. Gordy inhaled the scent of the incense and candles. So many things were burned in the house of God. She sat in a pew, 2 rows behind 2 young girls. She knew who they were. They were in the pink dormitory, but Gordy often saw them in the refectory. Every day for the last 2 weeks, Sister Fernanda had been bringing them to the chapel to pray for their father, who was due to be hauled before the firing squad. They were to plead for God's mercy and forgiveness. The nun would begin the prayers by counting down the remaining days until the execution, before asking the Lord to absolve their father of his crimes. Today, however, Sister Fernanda had groomed them carefully and dressed them in the uniform reserved for official visits. The 2 young sisters were looking up at the effigy of Christ with gratitude and respect, because he had saved their father. Gordy mused about the very different message she was going to deliver to Jesus when it was her turn to speak. She wouldn't be telling him everything out loud. She wanted to be sure she wouldn't be punished, not like the time she'd been locked up for 4 hours for crossing her legs. She would be content to use her inner voice to address the Lord. Lord of what, precisely, she had to wonder. Because apparently he could hear everything. The words that ran through her thoughts, as well as those that slipped out of her mouth, in spite of herself. Ah, Lord of the kingdom of heaven! Now she remembered. She was going to tell this Lord of the kingdom of heaven that he was a murderer.
After all, someone had to tell him, didn't they? Perhaps he would finally hear their prayers.
All 5 of them, she, Reme, Dulce, La Una, and La Dos, had been pleading for the same thing for months. 5 identical prayers.
Yet still he turned a deaf ear.
Sister Fernanda made the 2 young sisters stand up and led them to the altar. Then she wrapped her arms around them. They both shuddered in unison, since Sister Fernanda only ever touched the orphans with her braid of leather belts. Her hand only ever whipped and never stroked.
"It's time to ask Christ to take your father into his home now," the nun said in a calm, collected tone, smiling with the deference and gratitude she usually reserved for her God.
The young sisters turned to one another with a look of astonishment on their frozen faces. Then both turned deathly pale. The older girl reached for her little sister's hand.
"Papa's dead?"
the younger girl asked, glaring at the man on the cross. Her gaze drifted to her older sister's dress, then her carefully coiffed Sunday best hair.
"But we prayed so hard."
"Yes, and God heard your prayers, but he was not able to save your father." The older girl retreated a step, pulling her sister close. Her lips creased with suffering. "He was executed today," Sister Fernanda replied. "Let us pray for him now. Sit there and start with an Our Father." The 2 children staggered to the nearest pew and clasped their hands in prayer. Gordi was sure it wasn't a prayer they were going to say, though. They, too, were going to tell Jesus he was a murderer. Sister Fernanda walked over to Gordi. Gordi instinctively bowed her head, tucking her chin to her chest as if to take refuge in her shell. 162. It's good that you're here to pay your respects." Gordi lifted her gaze and looked the nun in the eye. She hesitated for a moment, weighing up the pros and the cons, then took the plunge.
"I came to have a word with him, with Jesus."
The nun steeled her gaze. And her fist. She had found her rage again, or rather, her rage had caught up with her.
"What did you come here to say to him?"
"That Father Murillo is hurting my friends." Sister Fernanda opened her eyes so wide, wrinkles crazed across her forehead.
"And what exactly is Father Murillo doing to your friends?"
"He's hurting them. Between their legs." Sister Fernanda grabbed her by the ear so hard that Gordi had to stand on tiptoe to quell the fire that was burning all over her face.
"You should be ashamed to say such ungodly things, you dirty little rat!"
Sister Fernanda let her go as suddenly as she had grabbed hold of her.
"Look what you made me do in the house of God!"
She clenched her teeth and clasped her hands tightly together, probably to stop herself from lashing out at her again, Gordi thought. "I'm not lying, sister. He makes 101 and 102 bleed every night, right here, between—"
"That's enough, you little rat!"
Sister Fernanda spat.
"I'm going to have to teach you a lesson to rid you of the demons inside you, you horrible little pest! How dare you insult a man of God!"
Sister Fernanda grasped Gordi by the scruff of her neck and frog-marched her to the door. She was going to grab her leather belts and whip her back to shreds, Gordi was sure of it. But she had still been right to come here and try to make herself heard, even though she knew now why God had not heard their prayers. He only listened to Sister Fernanda and Father Murillo. God only had ears for his soldiers, not his victims.
Falconbury Police Station, Thursday, the 8th of December, 2016, 11 a.m. Eleanor greedily tucked into her meatball and beetroot salad sandwich. It wasn't lunchtime yet, but they were all hungry by mid-morning, so Alexei had gone to fetch some goodies from the local bakery.
Bergström was in his office, on a conference call with Müller. Emily had excused herself, but Alienor wasn't sure where she was, and Alexei and Olofsson were still working their way through the list of patients. Whenever the phone rang, the detective picked it up straight away, hoping one of the Spanish numbers was calling back. Alienor opened the next email. She had spent all morning reading Louise's messages. So far, she hadn't found anything remotely of interest. One of the swing doors creaked open. The sound alone told Alienor it was Emily entering the room. The energy and emotion the profiler put into every gesture and every word were strictly measured. Alienor had never heard Emily raise her voice, or laugh, for that matter. A fleeting smile, a mere hint of a chuckle, were the closest she ever came to expressing joy. She seemed to have more in common with cats than people. Just like a feline, she was a hunter too. She shared their strategy of keeping a watchful eye on their prey until they were sure to overpower them, then emerging from the shadows to finish them off. Emily took a seat across the table. Alienor, we have the results of the DNA test. Louise and Leopold are your siblings, and Göran and Kerstin your parents. Alienor found Emily's efficient way of communicating information immensely gratifying. She always delivered a message directly, none of those pointless preludes that always ended up drawing out the suffering. That only proves we have the same genes. It doesn't add anything to our family or our kinship, and it doesn't take anything away. Alienor promptly returned to reading the emails, but then she paused and looked up at Emily, who was still sitting on the other side of the table as if she knew their conversation wasn't over and was patiently waiting for it to resume. Do you think that's why Louise was in my room when she died? She was leaving the SIM card in the journal? We don't know yet if she was the one who put it there. Perhaps because she was moving out, she wanted to leave it in a safe place, Alienor continued, as if she hadn't heard Emily's words. Maybe she read my journals, even. I wonder if that's why she was in my room. Have you been able to identify when her behavior returned to normal? Emily said, nodding at Louise's laptop to steer Alienor back to the present moment. At the end of November 2012, she replied, after a brief pause. The phone rang, interrupting their conversation. Olofsson quickly swallowed the mouthful he was chewing and pressed a button to take the call on speakerphone. Falkenbergspolisen. Buenos días, soy Paula Cuevas. ¿Usted me llamó? I'm sorry, I don't speak Spanish, Olofsson apologized in English. He sat up straight and pulled his chair closer to the table, as if the caller were sitting across the table from him. No problem. My name is Paula Cuevas. You called me this morning about a current investigation? Yes, of course. Thank you for calling us back. Can you tell me which investigation this is concerning? Is it something to do with the deaths in the Lindberg family? The story made the headline down here in Spain. Yes, it is. Paula Cuevas kept them hanging for a moment. They could make out a few muffled words in the background. I have some things to share with you, she said at last, but I don't want to say anything over the phone. I'm afraid I can't come to you, either. You'll have to come and see me. Let me pass you over to my lawyer, who will be happy to give you all the information you need to organize your visit. Senora Cuevas, can you at least tell us who was calling you from the Swedish mobile number 0046? I was in touch with Louise Lindberg. Calle de Alfonso XII, Madrid, Friday, the 9th of December, 2016, 11 a.m. Powerful columns of light were streaming in through the taxi windows. Alexei turned her face to the sun and breathed a contented sigh. In the south of Europe, the sun shone with pride, washing the sky such an intense azure shade of blue you couldn't help but smile. It oozed with the very essence of excess. If light could talk, this would be a heated debate full of gesticulation. It had not taken long for them to get their act together the previous day. Bergström couldn't leave the station, so he had asked Emily to fly down to Madrid and back in a day, to take a statement from Paula Cuevas. Alexei had been keen to go too, and the commissioner had immediately agreed. He just had to persuade the prosecutor to give them the green light. If he sold the idea as Emily's, he figured Müller's gratitude for the profiler's assistance in previous cases would hopefully spare them his usual wrath. Emily paid the taxi fare, and they stepped out onto the pavement. They were greeted by a porter at the door to the building, his radiant smile lifting the pointy ends of his dark mustache. He pushed open the ornate glass and wrought iron door and directed them towards an equally good-humored concierge. The way the Spaniards whistled their S sounds and rolled their R's sounded like drum rolls. Every sentence a celebration, Alexei thought. The concierge asked them to wait while he dialed ahead to announce their arrival, before calling the lift and sending them up to the 3rd floor. When the lift doors opened, Emily and Alexei saw a petite woman wearing a figure-hugging suit waiting for them in a doorway down the corridor. They followed a red carpet that looked like a tongue snaking over the black and white tiles. As they approached, the woman extended a slim hand with heavy rings weighing down every finger. "Hello, I'm Montse Romero, Paula's lawyer." She introduced herself in English, her carefully crafted curls bobbing between her ears and shoulders. "I have to ask you to leave your bags and phones here," she announced, closing the front door behind them. Emily stiffened. Alexei almost fainted. She was so averse to being separated from her laptop. At airport security, she always had to fight the urge to jump onto the conveyor belt and go through the X-ray machine with it. "I'm afraid we can't take the risk that our conversation might be recorded and leaked to the press," Montse said. "We've already signed a confidentiality agreement," Emily argued. "I'm sorry," the lawyer replied, pressing her ruby-red lips together. Emily slipped her backpack off her shoulder and placed it on the floor, and Alexei followed suit with her laptop case. Montse led them further into the apartment, down a dark hallway dotted with half a dozen doors. When they reached the last door on the left, Montse knocked to announce their arrival. The palatial bedroom was bathed in a warm light that seemed to lend an air of summer to the late autumn day. A woman toying with her 30s was lying in a high, generously proportioned bed with a sheet draped over an impressive circumference of belly. "Yes, I know," she smiled in response to the look of astonishment on Alexei's face. "It's huge, isn't it? I know it looks like I'm expecting triplets, but it's only twins. 2 big, bouncing boys, as you can probably guess. But just the 2 of them. Well, perhaps just isn't quite the right word." Montse invited Emily and Alexei to take a seat on the velvet chaise longue, facing the end of the bed. "I'm sorry I couldn't get up to meet you, but I've been on forced bed rest for the last 2 months. Our little 2 cherubs gave us quite a scare," Paula explained with a stroke of her belly. "Coffee?" Montse interjected with an inquiring look. Emily and Alexei graciously accepted, and Montse disappeared down the hallway for a moment or two. Paula waited until her lawyer returned before speaking again. "I must apologize for all these precautions, but my husband is a professional footballer, and there are some things we really mustn't divulge." She lowered her eyes for a second and pulled the sheet up to the very top of her belly. Emily's gaze wandered to the drapes framing the windows. "I read in the papers about what happened to Louise and her family," Paula continued. "Dios mío, what a terrible thing. I was thinking I should contact you. I spoke to my husband and Montse about it. Emily blinked as if she were just waking up and indulged Paula with a quick smile. A housekeeper wearing a black dress and white lace-trimmed apron brought a tray into the room and set it down on the coffee table in front of the chaise longue. "Anything for yourself, señora?" "No, gracias, Leticia." The housekeeper obediently nodded and left the room. "I think it would be best if you started at the beginning of your story," Montse suggested to Paula, playing with one of her rings, "to explain to these ladies how you came to be in touch with Louise Lindberg." Paula sat up in bed, moved a cushion out of the way, and pulled the sheet down. A white T-shirt hugged her belly like a second skin and tapered into a strange, crinkly shape at her waist. She stretched her legs, then tucked them beneath her to sit cross-legged. "My husband is sterile. We decided to have a baby with the help of a sperm donor," she explained, running the tips of her fingers over her belly. "Our doctors told us about the Lindberg Clinic, which had an excellent reputation and could guarantee our anonymity. So I flew to Gothenburg to start my treatment. We rented an apartment across from the clinic, and I stayed there for 4 months." Paula paused to smile, gazing tenderly at the mound of her belly, which must now always be in her field of vision. "I didn't offer any explanation to my friends here. They thought I was keeping my distance because of complications from a cosmetic surgery procedure. Anyway, I got pregnant on the 3rd try and came home to Madrid, but I lost the baby after 10 weeks. The hormonal treatments caused all kinds of respiratory systems and ovarian cysts, and I put on a lot of weight. So we decided to take a break for a while. After a year, we decided to try again through a different clinic, so we asked the Lindberg Clinic to transfer our embryos down here. I don't know if you're familiar with the process, but my eggs were fertilized with the donor's sperm in vitro. Then, once the embryos had formed, the strongest ones were frozen and kept in storage. There were 11 of them in my case. This method avoids having to repeat the treatment that stimulates the ovaries to produce more eggs, because no matter what the experts say, it can cause uterine and ovarian cancer. Alexei felt the urge to take a deep breath. She found this kind of relentless determination to have children highly unsettling. She couldn't wrap her head around it. Was simply living with someone really that unfulfilling? So anyway, we asked for our embryos to be transferred, Paula continued, but the people at the Lindberg seemed to be dragging their heels. And after several attempts to find out what was going on, we were finally told that the container carrying our embryos was damaged in transit, and that our embryos had been lost. Paula closed her eyes and exhaled with a long, shuddering sigh. Emily stared at her coffee, turning the cup around the saucer, oblivious to the shrill grating of the porcelain. The sound of Paula's voice drew her back to her senses. You can't imagine how devastated I was, and furious. The donor we had chosen was no longer available, and making that decision had been even harder than enduring the treatments. Do you realize we had to choose the biological father of our child just from some details on a piece of paper? And tried to find someone who looked like my husband based only on a photo of the donor when he was a child, or sometimes even just a baby. The whole thing was excruciating, especially for my husband. Of course, I wanted to take my frustration out on the clinic. I know that wouldn't have resolved anything, but I suppose I wanted to set an example and offload all that anger. But my husband was dead against it. As far as he was concerned, making our private drama public knowledge was out of the question. He was concerned about how others would see us. Afraid of their pity, I suppose. He wanted to live up to the image of the man his coach, teammates, and fans saw. That was when Louise Lindberg first contacted me, in the spring of 2012. She wanted to hear my side of the story. I told her what I really thought, that their clinic's reluctance to explain what had happened was an attempt to hide something. I never actually believed that our embryos had been damaged in transit. I thought they had made a mistake and were trying to nip a scandal in the bud. When and how many times were you in contact with Louise Lindberg? Emily asked. We spoke 3 times on the phone. And what was her take on the incident? The first time, she just asked me a few questions. I was quite unpleasant with her on the phone, actually. I was expecting a sincere apology and some discussion, but there wasn't. Believe it or not, I hung up on her. The second time, she told me she wasn't calling in an official capacity on behalf of the Lindberg Clinic. She said she just wanted to know what had happened. So I stated the facts and told her about my suspicions. The third and last time, she asked me some in-depth questions about the quality of my eggs, the donor's sperm, and the embryos. So I sent her all the details. I might not be a doctor, but let me tell you, after all these years of MAR treatments, you become something of an expert. What happened after the third phone call? I never heard from her again. Did you try to contact her? Paola glanced at her lawyer for a second, then lowered her gaze. No. Montse advised me not to. What was the name of the clinic where you were going to pursue your treatment? La Virgen del Pilar, of all places. Emily and Alexei frowned in puzzlement. They had never heard that name before, but Paola seemed to think it would mean something to them. But we ended up not going with them in the end, Paola went on. I went into a depression after that incident in 2012, and we decided to stop trying. We only started again at the beginning of this year, here in Madrid, and it worked the first time, gracias a Dios. When I think about La Virgen del Pilar, it sends shivers down my spine. Why? What happened? Paola and Montse exchanged a look of bewilderment. The lawyer tilted her head to one side, so that her curls kissed her shoulder. I don't understand. Did you not hear about it?
Thursday, the 17th of May, 2012. The music is back in my mornings, and Nino has found his smile again. I wake up eager and hungry to open my eyes, the way I did when I became a grandmother 20 years ago. Today I get to his place at 6:58 p.m. I make it to the front door, just in time to see his housekeeper leaving. Nearly 3 months ago, after I saw him on the news, I blended into the crowd of journalists that had set up camp on his doorstep. Nino drove me here the next day. He bathed me and dressed me and dropped me off at the corner of the avenue, in front of this bus shelter. I waited all afternoon for him to step outside, the image of the saggy, bloated man he had now become filling my mind, and his hoarse moans ringing in my ears. That evening, when Nino came back to pick me up, I didn't want to go home. I stayed in the bus shelter, reflecting on his face, the face of my suffering, my drowning, too. Then at 1 a.m, he walked right past me with his dog. The dog ignored me. It barely even turned its snout to sniff at the bench. It obviously wasn't a good guard dog, because it should have growled, because the only thing I could think of was killing its master. That was on the 23rd of February. Every night after that I came back to sit on that bench, and I waited until he walked past me with Athos. Every night the dog lingered a little more, and after 2 weeks he no longer flashed me a tense, fleeting, apologetic smile when he pulled at Athos's lead. But he did stop, and we exchanged a few words.
I recognized that look of his beneath his drooping eyelids, and his voice, weathered as it was by old age. He thought I was waiting for the night bus. There was nothing wrong with that. I insinuated that I worked for an old lady in the neighborhood. There was nothing wrong with that either. Perhaps I was the only person who wasn't quizzing him about the accusations hanging over his head, the ones his lawyer was trying so hard to dispel. He talked to me about his wife, his daughter, his dog. I listened to him, the smell of his breath and the memory of his hands grasping my hips never far from my mind. A few days ago, he came by without his dog. Athos was with his wife, he explained, but he still had to get out for his night-time walk. Otherwise he wouldn't be able to sleep. Or perhaps he needed to see me. Now, the lights in the grand townhouse start dancing from one room to another. I check the time. It's already 1:55. The hours have flown by without me realizing, yet I haven't moved a muscle. Every night, it's the same choreography. The kitchen on the first floor, the reception rooms one after the other, the hallway, the ground floor entrance, then a weaker light from a smaller window, perhaps the bathroom. Next, he opens the front door. If his dog were there, it would be pulling him out the door, scrabbling at the pavement with its paws, tongue hanging out and panting in excitement. I'm already sitting in the bus shelter at the corner of the avenue. This is the way he always walks to the park. I'm waiting for him. Tonight, I'm going to join him on his walk, to see what it feels like to stand at his level, stronger and less vulnerable.
Murillo Café, Calle Ruiz de Alarcón, Madrid, Friday, the 9th of December, 2016, 5 p.m. Emily and Alexei had easily found a seat on the terrace at the Murillo, which was deserted by the usual locals and tourists, who were probably put off by the chill in the air. Coming from Sweden, though, they had not hesitated for a second, and were now basking in the glow of the Spanish sun that always made everything better. They ordered 2 coffees while they waited for Bergström to call them. A young woman passed by the café, and her gaze lingered on Emily and Alexei as she walked into the building next door. Alexei wondered what had caught her eye. How had she interpreted what she saw? 2 friends enjoying a coffee? A couple on holiday? People's perceptions were often so different from the truth, she pondered. We all see the world through our own lens, which is shaped by our past and our upbringing, our desires and our fears. That was precisely what had happened earlier at Paula Cuevas' apartment. The young woman was brimming with life from the 3 hearts beating inside her, but all Alexei could see was the monumental belly and the self-sacrifice required to give life to another being, who would spell the end of the couple's relationship as they knew it. Emily, meanwhile, had been struggling with the memory of the child she lost, the baby who died in her arms. Alexei knew about Emily's personal drama, but this was the first time she had seen her friend suffering. The profiler had emerged from her thoughts only twice during their meeting with Paula Cuevas, managing to put her professional hat on briefly. But the pain had clearly proven to be too much, and she had retreated into herself again. The shrill ringtone of the iPad made them both jump. The faces of Bergström and Olofsson soon joined them on the cafe terrace. "Isn't it cold there?" Olofsson asked, between 2 gulps of water. "It's a lot warmer than where you call home," Alexei teased.
Let me remind you, Sweden's your home now, too. So, the commissioner interjected. Emily summed up the revelations Paula Cuevas had shared with them, from the supposed loss of the tank containing her embryos to her conversations with Louise. Louise must have suspected the clinic was trafficking embryos, eggs, or even sperm, Bergström thought out loud. She resigned, though. So what are we supposed to make of that? Olofsson asked, opening a Tupperware container. Does that mean her parents or her brother were behind it all? And she decided to step away instead of blowing the whistle? The detective pulled out a hard-boiled egg and ate half of it in a single bite. That's not all, Alexei cut in. The Lindbergh Clinic had ties to an MAR clinic in Madrid by the name of La Virgen del Pilar. Paula Cuevas was to report to that clinic if there was the slightest problem with her treatment. As it happens, in February 2012, Dr. Carlos Burgos, the head of that clinic, was accused of fertilizing patients' eggs with his own sperm. Sheesh! What a fucking nut job! Olofsson blurted through a mouthful of yolk and egg white. Have you contacted the clinic, or did it close down? Emily nodded. Yes, it was shut down, and Carlos Burgos is dead. Natural causes. He was 82 years old. More than 80 candles? Weren't his swimmers past their sell-by date? Olofsson blurted. Perhaps he'd been storing them for years. Oh, give it a rest. You're going to make me puke. Right, the commissioner interjected. I'm going to get in touch with the Spanish police to find out more information about that clinic. The Virgen del... What was it? La Virgen del Pilar. Bergström made a note of the name in his pocketbook. And it was Dr. Carlos Burgos, you said. Emily nodded. Alexei, why don't you come back to Falkenberg? I'm going to fly down to join Emily in Madrid. Why? Alexei protested, sitting up straight. If I'm not mistaken, you're getting married 8 days from now, are you not? My thoughts exactly. I still have a week left. Bergström rolled his eyes and shook his head in resignation. All right, then. Are you going to find a hotel, or should we book one for you? I've already sorted it, Alexei said. No news about the Norwegian number or the other Spanish one? Emily asked. Unfortunately not. They were both pay-as-you-go numbers. The Norwegian number is still disconnected, and I haven't had a call back from the Spanish one. I left another message this morning. Right then. Suerte, Bergström chirped before ending their video conference. Alexei sighed. The hardest part was yet to come, having to tell her mother she was staying in Madrid for a few more days. The Principal Hotel, Madrid, Friday, the 9th of December, 2016, 8 p.m. Alexei wedged the phone between her cheek and shoulder and scanned the room service menu. How was your day, maman? Yes, all fine, Mado piped, a bit too cheerily. What's that, maman? Just a second, her mother mumbled. I'm going up to my room. Alexei could hear her slippers clumping up the stairs, the hinges creaking open, then the door closing with a click. Alexei, my little sweet pea, you know you can tell me anything. You know I'll understand. You know I'll never judge you. Alexei closed her eyes and sat down on the bed. It's all right if you want to change your mind, her mother continued. Maman, that's not... Will you just listen to me for a second? Who do you think you are? You're not listening. Do you think it's normal? No, wait. What would you say to a friend? No, your sister. What would you say to Ines if, a week before her wedding, right before the family flies in from halfway across the world to get the party started, she were to swan off to a meeting in who cares where on sea, leaving everyone just standing there like lemons, including her husband-to-be? Well, I know what Freud would say. She doesn't really want to get married. But every couple is different, maman. Oh, don't go generalizing on me now, Alexei. Your sister, Xavier, and the little ones just got here, and you're nowhere in sight. No, because you're swanning off 5 minutes before Stellan slips the ring on your finger. Come on, you've got Sigmund written all over your face. Mado came up for breath for a moment. Listen, nothing's carved in stone. You're entitled to change your mind. But I don't want to change my mind, maman, Alexei protested. I just have a life beyond my role as a wife-to-be, do you see? All right, relax, her mother conceded. Don't you at least want to talk to Stellan about it again? We've spoken a few times today already, maman. That's why I said again. I don't see why you're dwelling on this so much. Is there something you're not telling me? Do you think he's not well? He's just a bit worried, Alexei. He's afraid you're going to the outback. To back out, you mean? Back out, yes. It's written all over his face. Can't you just reassure him? It breaks my heart to look at him. Alexei? Alexei had lifted the phone away from her ear. She had a call waiting. From a private number. She hesitated for a second and took the call anyway. Then she swore to herself when she realized she hadn't told her mother. As soon as she heard who was calling, Alexei hurried out of her room and ran down the corridor to Emily's. At last, they were going to find some answers.
La Virgen de los Desamparados Orphanage, Madrid, Saturday the 22nd of November, 1952. Gordi squeezed Launa's hand, tightly. The medic sat behind his desk and looked at them in turn before coughing into his fist. Sister Rosario asked me to give you both a checkup. He smiled at them. Gordi could see the sadness in his eyes. She told me you'd hurt yourselves playing in the courtyard. Is that right? Gordi looked at Launa. She lowered her eyes. Gordi tried to imagine that smile melting away the lump of pain that was stuck inside her belly. I'm a bit like God, the medic continued, coughing again. I'll listen to everything you tell me, and I'll keep any secrets you confide in me to myself. Gordi tugged at Launa's hand. Perhaps God had heard their prayers in the end, and he had sent someone to save them. Anything you tell me here, in this room, will stay between us, he insisted. Launa lifted her gaze and looked at the medic. He was still smiling. Gordi realized she had never seen a man smile before. He was the first. Can you at least tell me where it hurts? Neither of them dared say a word. Gordi squeezed Launa's hand tighter still. The medic cleared his throat and coughed into the back of his hand. Maybe you can tell me how you hurt yourselves, then? Father Murillo's voice, his warm breath on the back of her neck, in her ear, his clammy hands. Gordi willed Launa to smile. Come on, she thought. You can make it all better. But Father Murillo's hands smothered any hint of a smile. Gordi's heart started beating so hard she had to open her mouth wide to summon up what little air was left deep down in her lungs. Or perhaps you can tell me who hurt you. Father Murillo! Gordi suddenly blurted. Launa turned to her friend with a look of horror. It was him, Father Murillo, Gordi asserted bravely. And we are not the only ones he has hurt.
This is the end of CD 5. The book continues on CD 6. CD 6.
Chocolateria San Ginés, Madrid, Saturday, the 10th of December, 2016, 10 a.m. Alexei and Emily stepped out of the hotel and strolled a few hundred meters down the Calle de Alcalá. They crossed the vast stone expanse of the Puerta del Sol and kept going until they reached the Chocolateria San Ginés. The esteemed chocolate shop was a hole in the wall, tucked away down a rabbit warren of alleys steeped in years of history. Its nickname, La Escondida, the hideaway, was well earned. That morning, Madrid was again basking in the warm, golden light of the sun, which helped take the edge off the brisk chill that had descended on the city. They could smell the chocolate shop before they saw it. A heady scent of fried dough and sugar, reminiscent of summer fun fairs, drifted through the surrounding back streets. All that was missing was the sound of children's gleeful footsteps and cries of joy. Emily and Alexei went straight to the back of the cafe area, passing a group of men crowded around two tables who were in the middle of a heated discussion about the Prime Minister, Mariano Rajoy. Laughter abounded, and hands clapped heartily on the white marble bistro tables, lending a rhythm to their exchange. The previous evening, the person whose call had cut short Alexei's conversation with her mother was one Vicente Guardiola, a journalist with El País. Apparently, he had information for them about Dr. Burgos and his clinic, and wanted to meet them the next morning. When Alexei asked how he had got her number, he said they'd cover all that later, in a patronizing air that didn't bode well. One of the men stood up from the group and strolled towards the back of the cafe, continuing the repartee over his shoulder as he tucked his white shirt into his black pleated trousers and smoothed his artfully trimmed beard, getting ready to serve them, Alexei presumed. Alexei scanned the menu, suspecting that Emily would turn her nose up at the house specialty, churros con chocolate, that she yearned to order for herself. She decided she would just order a coffee instead. Alexei Castells? Vicente Guardiola. The man Alexei had mistaken for a waiter introduced himself. Perplexed, she stood up, and they shook hands. The journalist turned to Emily, who was now also on her feet. "This is Emily Roy," Alexei said. "What's the Yard doing poking its nose into this business, I wonder?" Guardiola said in English, with a smirk and a firm shake of the hand that Emily had extended. "I see we're already comparing penis size, Senor Guardiola," she quipped, returning his smile. His mouth gaped open, freezing his face in surprise. "Touché, Miss Roy," he conceded, looking Emily in the eye with a series of resigned nods of his head. He grabbed a chair from the next table and took a seat between them. "Hey, Vicente!" a waiter hollered from behind the counter at the other end of the cafe. Without turning around, the journalist raised his left hand and extended 3 fingers. "So, all roads lead to Sweden, it seems, via the Yard," he said, pushing the paper napkin holder into the middle of the table. "Your commissioner got in touch with our CID officers because he was fishing for information about Burgos and his clinic. That's how I got your number, Alexei. He gave it to the CID officers because your Spanish is apparently better than your intrepid profiler's." He winked at Emily. "And that same commissioner, Leonard Berrystrom, if you'll forgive any mispronunciation of his name, also left me a couple of messages. Now, assuming I've done my homework properly, his calls must have had something to do with the murders of the people who ran the Lindbergh clinic. One of the 3 victims was found in possession of your telephone number. Well, you certainly don't beat around the bush, do you, Emily? Yes, I was in touch with Louise Lindbergh. Can you at least tell me a bit more about her death? We don't know anything more than your Scandinavian counterparts, Vicente." Flashing a cocky, flamboyant smile,
He held Emily's gaze again with a kind of probing look that encroaches on your personal space so much it feels like skin contact. After a fruitless standoff with a deadpan Emily that lasted a good minute, he laughed and said, "You're a force to be reckoned with, aren't you?" At that very moment, a waiter breezed up to their table and slapped 3 cups of chocolate as thick as cream and a mountain of churros on an oval platter on the cold marble, as well as a bottle of water and 3 glasses to wash it all down. At the end of 2011, I published a series of articles in El País about medically assisted reproduction and, more specifically, in vitro fertilization, Guardiola began, pouring them each a glass of water. I raised a flag about a few things, including the conditions surrounding the selection of sperm donors and the handling of their personal information. That was what I originally set out to do. But as I investigated, I inadvertently struck gold. It turned out that the big boss of La Virgen del Pilar Clinic, that saco de mierda Carlos Burgos, was not only using his own sperm to impregnate his patients, but unbeknownst to them, he was also using top-quality eggs and embryos sourced from strangers, all to boost his clinic's success rate. Vicente Guardiola dipped a sugar-coated churro into his cup and took a big bite, dripping with chocolate. Louise first reached out to me at the end of January 2012. Because she had read my articles, he continued, munching the last of his churro. She told me that, officially, La Virgen del Pilar was supplying the Linberia Clinic with sperm from donors with Mediterranean, South American, and North African profiles. But Louise insinuated that the 2 clinics were trafficking embryos. She suspected that certain embryos that had been put into storage and forgotten, and others that should have been destroyed, were being used in patients whose own embryos had slim chances of surviving, all against their knowledge. She didn't know who was implicated, but she had her suspicions, which she refused to share with me, unfortunately. "What do you mean, forgotten?" Alexei asked, swallowing a mouthful of hot chocolate and savoring the rich, sugary goodness that coated her tongue and palate. Guardiola reached for a minuscule paper napkin and wiped his lips. During a cycle of in vitro fertilization, several eggs are fertilized. 1, maybe 2 of those that turn into embryos are implanted into the patient's uterus 2 to 6 days after they form. The others are then frozen and put into storage in anticipation of a later pregnancy, should the patient want another child. Clinics then bill patients every 6 months for keeping their embryos in storage. Often, after 1 or 2 pregnancies, patients decide they no longer need those embryos, and the clinic supposedly destroys them. In fact, more often than not, they completely forget about the embryos, and the direct debit keeps coming out of the patient's accounts every 6 months, lost in the sea of other household expenses. Meanwhile, all this raw material is just sitting at the bottom of a freezer in the MAR clinic, waiting to be exploited. Alexei rinsed her mouth with a sip of water. That seemed to fit with Paula Cuevas' story about her embryos supposedly being lost in transit. Perhaps the clinic had used them to impregnate other women. And as for that filthy gilipollas Burgos, I'm still investigating his death. Emily frowned. She opened her mouth to say something, but Guardiola beat her to it. "That's right, little Miss Profiler. I saved you the best for last," he teased, with more than a little suggestive arching of his eyebrows. "Burgos, the filthy old pervert, didn't die of natural causes." Guardiola licked his chocolate-covered fingers. "I think now's a good time for us to measure our penises.
Wouldn't you say, Emily?
La Virgen de los Desamparados Orphanage, Madrid, Wednesday, the 3rd of December, 1952. Gordi closed the door of the infirmary behind her. It had taken her a while, but she had found a way. It hadn't been easy because it meant playing along, getting snared in the trap. In the end, though, it was so simple. She was appalled she hadn't thought of it before. She would look at the map of Spain on the wall, choose a town or city, and escape there. She would plan and erect buildings, plant forests, sit in a churreria and eat to her heart's content, or go into a shop and buy a hat or some sweets. She would only return to the real world when the pleats of her skirt were lowered back over her thighs, when she heard the barking of his cough, the rustling of creased cloth as he tucked his shirt back into his trousers, the growling of his zipper teeth closing up again. They were the only sounds that filled the suffocating silence, when the grip of the shame and suffering felt even tighter than the fear. Gordi straightened her blouse and went to join the others in the courtyard. She listened as Reme told her and Dulce how the new girl had been forced to eat tadpoles because she'd been caught drinking from a puddle. But she had other things on her mind besides the new girl's misadventures. She was thinking about La Una and La Dos, who had gone into the infirmary as she had left. They had started calling the medic Tos, because he coughed all the time, and Tos had the appetite of an ogre, as it turned out. Of course he did. After all, he was an ogre. An ogre who whispered in the ear of God, just like Father Murillo.
Chocolateria San Ginés, Madrid, Saturday, the 10th of December, 2016, 11 a.m. Vicente Guardiola ducked behind the counter and emerged with a laptop and a fresh bottle of water. He paused for a moment beside the group of men who were still chatting away around the tables at the front of the chocolateria. A game of dominoes was now in full swing. Tiles crashed down like cymbals against the marble table, provoking cheers of encouragement, groans of defeat, guffaws of laughter, and friendly slaps on the back. It was a jovial but ear-splitting cacophony. "Hombre, good move!" Guardiola boomed to the man who played the last tile. "Es que le estoy matando, tío," the man replied, puffing out his chest and throwing his arms wide open, as if to prove he really was killing it. Guardiola dealt the man a few healthy pats on the back as he made his way over to rejoin Emily and Alexei. Burgos did not die as peaceful a death as the media have portrayed, the journalist said, opening his laptop. It's remarkable how the whole thing has been kept under wraps. That dirty bastard must have known a thing or two that the powers that be wanted him to take to his grave. Whenever something big like this happens, it's like a red rag to a bull for the swarms of shit-stirrers like me. So you'd have expected all the skeletons in the old man's closet to be dug up and paraded in public, wouldn't you? But nothing at all came to light. If it hadn't been for my CID contact, I'd never have known. Even now, I haven't published anything about it. And whoever did him in still hasn't been caught. For what it's worth, whoever that was deserves a pat on the back. I've spent the last 4 years combing through his patient lists, his potential victims, essentially, trying to track down whoever got rid of the old creep. It's a mammoth task. You can't imagine how many women that nutjob must have inseminated in all his years of practice. Surely his victims must have banded together and formed support groups, though, Alexei wondered out loud. Did no one agree to help you? Most of them have refused to undergo a DNA test. I suppose they think sweeping this whole thing under the carpet will make them forget about it. Whereas the truth is, they're always going to keep tripping over it. Guardiola paused to open a file on his laptop that appeared to be double password protected. "Whoever killed Burgos must have done it in blind rage," he said, turning the screen towards Alexei. "You'll have to translate it for your girlfriend." "Is that the autopsy report?" Emily cut in. "Yes, it is, Ms. Roy," the journalist replied, taking a sip of water. Alexei quickly scrolled through the document. She turned to Emily suddenly, before zeroing in on the screen again. "Carlos Burgos suffered multiple stab wounds," she translated robotically. "His mouth and tongue were slashed to shreds, and his tongue was almost completely cut out." Emily inched towards the screen, as if by seeing it close up, she would somehow be able to read Spanish. "Well, I think that answers the question that was on the tip of my tongue earlier," Guardiola ventured. "The Lindberries were killed the same way as that sleazy bastard Burgos, weren't they?" The Principal Hotel, Madrid, Saturday, the 10th of December, 2016, 10 p.m. Alexei tossed tea bags into the first 2 mugs, added a spoonful of instant coffee into the third, and filled them all with boiling water. She set 2 of them down on the narrow desk where Emily and Guardiola were hard at work, before taking a careful sip of her tea, cupping her hands around the mug. Once they had skimmed through Burgos's autopsy report, they had decided to continue their research at the hotel, where it would be quieter. They set up in Emily's room and started translating the investigation reports and witness statements surrounding the death of Dr. Carlos Burgos. Burgos had been knocked out, then stabbed multiple times in the chest. His lips had been slashed to ribbons, and his tongue nearly hacked out of his mouth. It was the same modus operandi as they had seen in the killings of Kerstin, Louise, and Göran Lindberg. The wounds had been inflicted with less precision, however, and the killer's movements seemed to have been more haphazard and improvised. It had taken 2 blows to render Burgos unconscious, one to his left temple and the other to the crown of his head, with an object the killer had found at the scene. It was a small marble sculpture depicting a pregnant woman. Poetic justice, as Guardiola put it. Afterwards, the killer had put the bloodied sculpture back on the mantelpiece. The 6 knife wounds to the abdomen were not very deep. Some were only superficial, and the tongue had not been fully removed. According to the medical examiner, the killer must have made multiple attempts to remove the tongue, which would explain the lacerations on the lips. The killer had ended up slicing the face open from one corner of the mouth to the hollow of the cheek to reach the tongue. This new information told them 2 things. First, that the killing of Dr. Burgos was connected to the murder of Alianor's family, and second, that there were probably more victims, since the perpetrator's technique had become more refined between killing Burgos in 2012 and the Lindbergs in 2016. They were pursuing 3 angles of investigation: digging into Burgos's past, combing through his clinic's patient files, and searching for other murder cases with similar hallmarks to the killer's. When Emily had called Bergström to tell him about their meeting with Vicente Guardiola and the information he'd given them, she had asked the commissioner to get in touch with his contact in the Spanish National Police to request access to the investigation reports and hopefully uncover the missing links in this chain of murders. Even though Emily was sure the old doctor was their victim zero and that everything had started with him, they were still taking the precaution of extending their search back to 2007, 5 years before Burgos was killed. Guardiola's mobile rang. He picked up the call without taking his eyes off the laptop screen. After a few strings of "sí, vale" and "gracias," he hung up. "Good news, chicas," he smiled. "I've been given the green light to access the Central Police database, but I have to go right now."
Emily and Alexei both sprang to their feet, pulled on their coats, and grabbed their bags. Guardiola chuckled and shook his head. Joder. Bloody hell, there are only 2 of you, but I feel like there's an army standing in my way. You're not going to take no for an answer, are you? Emily couldn't help but smile. You're a dark horse, little Miss Profiler, he conceded, a half-smile spreading to the corners of his lips as he buttoned up his jacket. Why do I get the feeling I've been relegated to the back seat like a little kid? Not that long ago we were comparing penis sizes, and now I feel like I should be begging you to go easy on my family jewels. The journalist hailed a cab, and they drove around the other side of the park to the El Retiro District Police Station, a 3-story building with red bars over the windows. A man in a dark suit and a tie that throttled his flabby neck was waiting for them outside, smoking a cigarillo. Dos chicas, joder, tío, qué salud tienes, he whispered in Guardiola's ear with a knowing wink, clearly impressed at his friend's ability to attract 2 such fine specimens of the female sex. ¿Qué tal, Pepe? Good to see you too, the journalist replied, giving the man a hearty pat on the back. Pepe stubbed out his cigarillo underfoot, then offered Emily and Alexei a brief handshake before inviting them all to follow him into the station. They zigzagged their way through a maze of deserted desks and chairs to an immaculate workstation in the middle of the open-plan office. Pepe draped his suit jacket over the back of the chair. Hasta ahora, guapo. I'll be back later, he grinned to his friend, scratching his protruding stomach with nicotine-yellowed nails. He sidled off with a fresh box of cigarillos in hand, leaving them to it. Guardiola pulled up 2 other chairs, and the 3 of them sat down at the computer. The journalist clicked a mouse button to deactivate the screensaver. Then, on the login screen, he typed José Pérez Vicente, followed by a password that appeared only as a series of asterisks. A new page opened with a prompt for 2 access codes. He typed one from memory, then he looked on the underside of the keyboard and entered a series of 6 letters and numbers he saw scrawled on a post-it note. So, we're starting in 2007, are we? He asked, as a search window opened on the screen in front of them. Emily nodded. Let's get this show on the road, chicas, he said, his fingers already racing across the keyboard. The Principal Hotel, Madrid, Sunday, the 11th of December, 2016, 10:30 a.m. It had been years since Alexei had pulled an all-nighter. The last time, she must have still been in her 20s. At 5:30 that morning, Pepe had poked his head in to tell them there was half an hour left before they would have to leave the station. Alexei couldn't believe what time it was when she checked her phone. It was strange how quickly the hours had flown by, and how awake, alert, and focused her body and mind had remained, oblivious to the night. The fatigue had knocked her out in the taxi on the way back to the hotel. Once she was back in her room, she had barely bothered to take off her coat and shoes before lying down, pulling the quilted bedspread over her, and falling fast asleep. Barely 20 minutes earlier, she had been fast asleep when Emily called to tell her they had a video conference with Falkenberg at 10:30. She had jumped straight into the shower and had only just joined Emily in her room when a close-up of Olofsson's face filled the laptop screen. When the detective stepped back from the screen to sit down, Bergström, Alienor, and Mona appeared in the background, sitting by the whiteboard at the end of the conference room table. Alexei was surprised to see Alienor. Surely she had no place being here as they picked her family drama to pieces. Hey, Olofsson chirped. Tell me, how are Cagney and Lacey doing? Jeez, Alexei, what's this I'm seeing? Death by sangria? Alexei winced. She had thought she looked surprisingly peppy, in spite of the lack of sleep. Apparently, the light over the bathroom mirror was more forgiving than Olofsson's critical eye. A contact of Vicente's gave us access to the main police database. We've spent all night in the neighborhood police station trying to track down cases similar to the murder of Carlos Burgos and the... Alexei left the words hanging. She didn't have the heart to finish her sentence, with Aliénor looking at her. Müller gave Aliénor the green light to be here, the commissioner explained, obviously noticing Alexei's discomfort. We're in the process of combing through all the family's emails. They each had several email accounts, as well as their phone records from 2011, 2012, and 2013, to check whether any of them were in contact with Burgos or his clinic. Aliénor was keen to roll up her sleeves. How many unsolved cases like this did you find in the system? 26 cases where the victims were stabbed and/or had their tongues slashed or cut out, Emily said. We'll be going through all of those this afternoon. Guardiola should be here in the next hour or so to help us. I can't help but notice that unlike you, Alexei here is on first-name terms with Guardiola. I wonder if that means you've succumbed to his Mediterranean charms, Alexei, Olafsson teased. Well, I have to admit, Vicente's certainly easy on the eye, she replied. One hell of a red-hot hunk, you mean, Olafsson said. We did our homework about the guy and came across 1 or 2 photos. Makes me think of Julio, wouldn't you agree? Julio who? Aliénor asked. What do you mean, Julio who? Julio Iglesias, for F's sake. Personally, I think he looks more like Joaquin Cortez, Alexei chimed in. Oh, I couldn't agree more, Mona suddenly piped up, her cheeks flushing as she immediately regretted her spontaneous outburst. Who's Joaquin Cortez? Aliénor asked. A flamenco dancer. Sensuality incarnate, Alexei sighed dreamily. No news about the Norwegian number? Emily swiftly changed the subject. Bergström shook his head and held his face wearily in his hands. We'll call you back tomorrow morning, Emily said, before disconnecting the Skype chat without further ceremony. Not wasting any time, she plugged a USB stick into her laptop and opened the first police report. Alexei got up and put the kettle on. So? She asked, stretching. Emily raised her eyebrows questioningly and shook her head. Vicente, is he more of a Julio Iglesias or a Joaquin Cortez? Emily's phone rang. Joaquin Cortez, she replied with an elusive smile before picking up. The sound of the kettle purring to life covered the few hushed words Emily exchanged. She ended the call and stared at the screen in her hand for a second before turning to Alexei. Pepe called Carlos Burgos' daughter this morning to let her know there'd been a development in the investigation into her father's murder. She's agreed to meet with us at her place. We're expected at 1 this afternoon. 60 Avenida de Menéndez Pelayo, Madrid, Sunday, the 11th of December, 2016, 1 p.m. Francisca Burgos was waiting in the doorway, her face partly in shadow. She stepped aside to usher Emily and Alexei over the threshold and closed the door behind them. Her warm, welcoming smile faded as soon as the handshakes were over. I'm sorry. I hadn't realized how dark it was in here, she apologized in Spanish, pushing a switch below the intercom by the front door. A dim glow radiated from the ceiling light and wall sconces, revealing walls checkered with framed black and white photographs, remnants of grandeur put on display to showcase the Burgos' social standing, to show visitors who they knew, and therefore who they were. Come this way. She led them into a drawing room with tall windows framed by heavy olive-green drapes. I'm afraid I don't speak English, but your colleague said you speak Spanish? She ventured, smoothing her cream suit. Yes, of course, Señora Burgos, Alexei smiled. Francisca Burgos motioned for Emily and Alexei to sit on the sofa as she took a seat in a grand Voltaire armchair upholstered the same faded green as the curtains.
She sat on the edge of her seat with her back straight, her pose the hallmark of a proper upbringing. "Did you both sign the confidentiality agreement?" She glanced first at Emily, then Alexei. Alexei nodded and pulled out the documents Pepe had emailed to her, which they had printed at the hotel's business center earlier that morning and signed before setting out. Francisca Burgos read the papers thoroughly before folding them and placing them on the chair cushion behind her. She allowed herself to sigh, massaging one liver-spotted hand with the other. "I understand you have some information about my father's death." Emily had written some questions for Alexei to put to Dr. Burgos's daughter, or rather, she'd listed the information she wanted to find out. Alexei was used to meeting with victims' families as part of her research for her true crime books. Over the years, she had honed her own standard list of questions, and she would adapt it depending on who she was talking to and their emotional state. What Emily was asking was very different from her usual spiel, however. "It appears that similar murders have been committed abroad. So similar that you think it's the same killer?" Francisca Burgos cut in. "Yes. Who are the victims?" "The owner of a medically assisted reproduction clinic and his family." "And his family," she echoed, pulling at the joints of her bony fingers. "Did your parents have a dog?" Alexei segued. "Yes, Athos." "Where was he on the night of the murder?" "At the care home with my mother. She was admitted there the year before my father was killed. She had Alzheimer's. The care home was wonderful. They had a pet therapy program, which was supposed to help the residents relax and rekindle memories for them. We used to take Athos to see Mama every day. Then, one day, Athos didn't want to leave when it was time to go home. An impish smile crept across her time-weathered face. He just barked and barked at anyone who tried to put him on his lead, and he wouldn't let anyone other than Mama touch him. So we left him there for the night. But—" She paused and looked inquisitively at Alexei. "There was no mention of Athos in the investigation. So how did you—" "Your father was embroiled in a scandal that effectively stopped him from setting foot outside his own front door." Francisca's expression stiffened. She straightened her posture even further and tightened her grip on the upholstered armrests of the chair. The journalist had set up camp on his doorstep, and he went for weeks without seeing the light of day. He would never have opened his door to a stranger in the middle of the night, Alexei continued. "No, he certainly wouldn't have. Are you trying to say he might have opened up to someone he knew?" "Do you have a suspect in mind, Señora Burgos?" "No, but your reasoning sounds a lot like an accusation to me." "Not at all. According to your statement, you were at home all night with your husband, weren't you?" Francisca Burgos gave a curt nod. "Other than you and his housekeeper, I don't think your father would have opened the door to anyone at 1 a.m. And you and she both had keys to his home at that time, did you not?" She nodded again. "So, if you had come to visit him in the middle of the night, you would surely have found him upstairs in the living quarters, not downstairs by the door." Alexei paused to let that sink in. "Which brings me back to why he went out that night, around midnight." Francisca Burgos blinked, and a wrinkle appeared across her chin. "I'm not judging, Señora Burgos. My colleague analyzed the crime scene based on the police report and photographs to establish what we call a profile of the victim, your father. That profile helps us to understand the sequence of events and the circumstances of the crime, and therefore the criminal." Francisca Burgos visibly relaxed. Her face softened, and her hands let go of the armrests and seemed to find some peace on her thighs, palms wide open. Alexei silently breathed a sigh of relief. Labeling Dr. Burgos a victim had eased the tension in the air and given her some room to maneuver. So, to wrap up my colleague's reasoning, if your father was in the habit of going out at such an odd hour, Emily figured it must be a logical time for him to take his dog for a walk. And he was so used to going out at that time, he had to do so, even if his faithful friend wasn't there. 14 years, Francisca Burgos interjected philosophically. 14 years, Papa took Athos for a walk every single night. She rummaged in her jacket pocket and pulled out a cigarette case and a lighter. Then she opened the case with one hand, plucked out a cigarette with the other, and snapped the case shut. Perhaps that's why Mama developed Alzheimer's, so she wouldn't see my father's, her husband's, fall from grace, and that dirty, ugly death. She lit the cigarette, her mouth hollowing around the filter as she inhaled a long, greedy drag. It was the housekeeper who found his body, wasn't it? Asked Alexei. Yes. She phoned you before she called for help, and you got there about 10 minutes before the police. Is that correct? Are you going to ask me to walk you through the scene step by step? To see if I remember the slightest little spot of blood on my father's suit? Is that it? Francisca waved a dismissive hand through the cloud of smoke in front of her face. Or if I can recall how his mouth was sliced open from cheek to cheek, or how his tongue was cut to shreds and hanging out of his mouth like a dog's? No, Senora Burgos. I'd just like to know whether you touched your father's body before the police arrived. Francisca picked up a bowl from the coffee table and emptied it of potpourri. Then she stubbed out her cigarette in it. I made him look decent. She drew a circle in the ash at the bottom of the bowl, then left her cigarette end right in the middle. His trousers and underpants were pulled down around his knees.
Thursday, the 17th of May, 2012. The look on Nino's face is the hardest thing for me to deal with, because it usually mirrors my anguish. But tonight it is blank and expressionless. I'm not shaken up and I'm not scared, even though I should be. Burgos is dead. He invited me in for a nightcap after our walk. Just an old man and an old woman having a drink, he said. Imagine that. I felt no panic when I saw his body lying on the floor in the middle of the hallway. No satisfaction either. The only thing that crossed my mind was that he wouldn't be going on and on about his dog any more, or his wife, or his daughter, and, with a bit of luck, he wouldn't be panting in my ear any more either. That would be a lot harder to do without a tongue, anyway. I walk into the kitchen to pour myself a beer. I can feel Nino's eyes burning a hole in my back. There are some things we can't share, my sweet Nino. I can't tell you, for example, that I felt a burning desire to take a knife to the part of him that had hurt me the most. But when I pulled his pants down, I couldn't bring myself to touch him. Maybe it's because his penis wasn't the way I remembered it. It was miserable and flaccid. His pubic hair was all white now, but the scar lurking beneath was still the same. I take a sip of my frothy bubbles. I can't shake the image of that shriveled little thing from my mind. I shudder to think how many lives, how many women that wrinkled lump of flesh destroyed. Isn't it funny, when you stop to think about it, how quickly you can go from wanting to sate your desire at someone else's expense to pleading for your own life?
El Retiro Park, Madrid, Monday, the 12th of December, 2016, 5 a.m. Emily toyed with the little black box in the inside pocket of her jacket as she hastened her pace. She lifted her knees higher and lengthened her stride, pushing the pain higher, her lungs burning from the cold air and her muscles consumed by the effort. An hour earlier, she had received a message from Aliénor with the family photos she had asked her for. Aliénor had mentioned that the funeral was going to be on the 22nd of December, 20 days after they died, 3 days before Christmas. The Swedish took time to bury their dead, just long enough to relive the loss and suffering and dwell on the grief and sorrow, just long enough to summon up the tears of absence and emptiness one more time. The waiting was like losing the person all over again, just as you were starting to come to terms with the fact that they were gone and learning to embrace the memory of them. Emily saw the hotel as she rounded the corner and slowed to a walk for the last few meters, taking the time to calm her breath and collect her thoughts. As soon as she was back in her room, she extricated the little black box from her pocket, opened it, and turned her thoughts to Aliénor's family. She lingered on Louise for a moment. Then she thought about Carlos Burgos. Emily undressed, dripping pearls of sweat onto the black parquet floor, and stepped into the shower. After their conversation with Francisca Burgos, Guardiola had joined them at the hotel to go through the 26 case files they had pulled from the police records the night before. They had soon narrowed the list down to 6 cases of interest and reached out to the families of the victims. 3 of them had already returned their calls. Emily directed the stream of icy water onto her calves, then moved it up to her thighs. Based on her initial observations from the Lindbergh crime scene, Shashtin was the key victim. But where did Carlos Burgos fit into the puzzle? His murder made sense as a mirror image of Göran Lindbergh's, 2 heads of MAR clinics, both killed in a similar fashion. And if Burgos's family had been there that night, would the killer have eliminated them too, like the Lindberghs? Although, how would this theory explain the fact that the killer had inflicted the least damage on Göran's body? Had the killer somehow thought that Shashtin was the brains behind the clinic? Maybe the murders were all about her, not Göran. But could Göran have been inseminating patients with his own sperm, like Burgos? They couldn't ignore the role of Louise, either. She had to be the one who had uncovered the connection between the 2 clinics. Perhaps she had been killed because she had chosen to protect her family rather than blowing the whistle on the clinic's shady practices. Could she have been killed because she had, however unwittingly, stumbled across the identity of Burgos's killer? In that case, could she have been the main target, as the extent of the wounds inflicted by the killer would seem to suggest? Emily stepped out of the shower and climbed back into bed, her body still damp. Guardiola slid a warm hand between her thighs. She was ready. More than ready. He twisted her damp hair away from her shoulders, onto the pillow, exposing more skin. He licked a few droplets of water from the nape of her neck, and paused to smile. Emily had moaned more making love than she had spoken the whole time they had worked together, he mused. She urged him back to her with her eyes. Then she turned her gaze away to the bedside table, where her mobile was ringing. It wasn't even 6 yet. She wriggled free from Vicente's embrace to grab the handset. He released her from his arms, flaunting his desire, waiting for her to come back for more. It was Bergström calling. Emily sat up cross-legged on the bed. She pressed the green button and listened to what the commissioner had to say, his calm voice belying the urgency of his call. Then she hung up. She got dressed without the slightest glance at Guardiola and left the room.
La Virgen de los Desamparados Orphanage, Madrid, Wednesday the 4th of March, 1953. Spring wasn't far away now. There wasn't such a chill in the air anymore, and the scent of flowers had started to drift in on the breeze. They no longer needed to do their morning exercises to warm up for chanting Cara al Sol. Father Murillo had instigated those exercises over the winter, after several of the girls had succumbed to the cold and collapsed. He'd got a bit carried away, however, and was making them run and jump on the spot to the point of exhaustion. They were too out of breath to sing Franco's praises, though, so they all ended up wheezing and spluttering their way through his song. Gordi had overheard a hushed conversation between a group of older girls before they went off to work in the factory. They were talking about the execution of their parents, saying that the church existed to serve the devil. She and Launa had another theory, though. The church was the devil. But the man on the cross didn't know it. He didn't know that the men who claimed to be his servants had changed sides, that they killed and raped with passion and conviction, with their faith even. As they neared the end of the courtyard, well away from Father Murillo and Sister Fernanda, Gordi slowed to a walk to nurse the stitch in her side. Launa and La Dos were still running just in front of her. Remé and Dulce were a bit further ahead. It struck Gordi how she was always the one who ended up on her own. She was the third wheel who always rolled along between the two sisters and Remé and Dulce. But whenever she had to spend time with Tos or with Father Murillo, she preferred to be alone, and was glad she didn't have to see the mirror image of her suffering the way Launa and La Dos did. Gordi wondered whether she would find herself begging for death to take her away like La Dos had done once. She had snuck into the infirmary and spent all night huddled up to a girl who was dying, hoping the Grim Reaper would come for her too. All of a sudden, La Dos collapsed, her legs flopping like ribbons beneath her. Gordi rushed to her friend's side. Launa was already wrenching her little sister's arms away from her belly, trying to find the source of the pain.
"That's enough! On your feet, right now!"
Father Murillo thundered up to them, his leather belt whip trailing over the shoulder of his cassock. He grabbed La Dos by the arm and hauled her to her feet. She groaned and immediately bent double from the pain, before crumpling to the ground once more.
"That's enough, I said! Stand up!"
La Dos huddled tight in the fetal position, scraping her hip and shoulder against the gravel. With a crack of leather, Father Murillo whipped her loins. Her body arched, recoiling from the impact, then immediately curled up in a ball again, the way Launa's had that night in the showers, Gordi thought. Sister Fernanda rallied all the girls, and they instinctively huddled around in a circle. She pulled Launa away from her sister and made her stand in the front row, to make sure she had a close-up view. Father Murillo raised his arm again and whipped the belts down on La Dos's back. The crack of leather on skin was so loud it smothered her cry. Without warning, Launa ran up to the priest. She grabbed the belts from his hand and yanked them towards her with astonishing strength, pulling Father Murillo off balance. He landed on his knees and moaned in pain as the gravel dug into his flesh. Then he swore. A glint of triumph flashed in Launa's eyes, a precarious, fleeting glimmer of freedom for them all to relish. But Sister Fernanda was only 2 strides away. She snatched the belt whip from Launa's grip and dealt her a vicious lash to the back of the neck as Father Murillo struggled back to his feet. Then she whipped her again between her shoulder blades. Launa was thrown to the ground, but she got right back up again. She turned around and opened her arms wide to form a cross, howling like a wild animal with her mouth wide open as she thrust her chest forwards to take the blows she knew were coming. Relentlessly, the nun whipped Launa's breasts, belly and thighs, every blow harder than the last. In a blind rage, she kept raising her arm and cracking it down again, until Launa finally crumpled to the ground beside her sister. Launa was struggling to keep her eyes open, gritting her teeth to resist every crack of the whip. With every blow, she choked back the pain, echoing Lados's tears. The sound of the leather whistling through the air and cracking against Launa's skin rang out like a chorus. Gordi noticed that Dulce was standing just in front of her, squeezing Reme's hand. A stream of urine flowed down her leg, splashing her shoe. Then, all of a sudden, Launa fell silent. But the chorus continued, out of tune. All that remained to be heard was the sharp crack of the whip and the sound of Launa's inanimate body crunching against the gravel, in time to every blow.
The Principal Hotel, Madrid, Monday, the 12th of December, 2016, 7 a.m. Emily and Alexei were sitting side by side at the narrow desk in Alexei's room, eyes glued to the laptop screen in front of them. The camera in the interview room at Falkenberg police station was trained on an empty seat. They heard a door creak open, then the sound of a chair scraping over the floor. A woman in an overcoat and woolen hat walked into the room and sat down. It took them a moment to recognize her. "This is Commissioner Lennart Bergström speaking," the commissioner said, for the benefit of the recording. "Today is Monday, the 12th of December 2016, and it is now 2 minutes past 7 in the morning. Interview with Sinja Skor, conducted in English, with Ms. Skor's permission." The acting managing director of the Lindberg Clinic had none of her previous authority and panache. Her puffy eyes flitted from one wall to the other before honing in on her interviewer. "Ms. Skor, do you recognize the Norwegian mobile number 0047-452-34777? "Yes, that's my number," she said, taking off her hat and smoothing down her short hair with her fingers. "Why do you have a Norwegian number?" "I bought a pay-as-you-go mobile when I was visiting family in Ålesund in 2012. After delivering her answer, she fell quiet. Bergström held the silence for a few moments before he went on. "According to your colleague Leopold Lindberg's phone records, he called you on average around 6 times a day that year." Sinja lowered her gaze and nodded. "Leopold Lindberg told us that was when you started to see each other." She pursed her lips, then the corners of her mouth fell. "That's right," she mumbled to the commissioner with a look of hesitation. "Are you still together?" "Yes." She exhaled a long, shuddering sigh. "But we didn't want Leopold's family to find out. Göran and Kerstin wouldn't have... I don't think they would have approved." "What about your husband?" "We've been separated for more than a year. He doesn't know either." "And Louise? Did she know?" Sinja Skor scrunched her eyes closed, as if she were wincing in pain. She shook her head. "I don't think anyone knew about us. But you used the same phone to contact Louise, too, Sinja." She stiffened, staring wide-eyed at Bergström with her mouth agape. "The number you called Louise at was also for a pay-as-you-go phone." Sinja closed her eyes. She kept them tightly shut for a good minute, while she pursed and twisted her lips, as if she were lost for words. When she opened them again, she buried her gaze in the table. "In January 2012, Louise came to see me in my office. She was preparing some marketing materials for the spring conferences and trade shows, and had been crunching the numbers for 2011. She couldn't understand how there could have been such a dramatic improvement in the quality of some of our patients' eggs and embryos. She sent about 6 files over to me, and we arranged to discuss them the next day. Signe paused and drew an imaginary line on the table with her eyes. My role as clinical director involves meeting with patients the first time they come into the clinic, she continued. Then I establish a protocol tailored to their specific case. In other words, whatever tests are needed to determine the proper treatment. After that, if need be, I oversee the clinical decisions, but I don't monitor individual patients. She moistened her lips. That night, as promised, I went through the files Louise had sent me, and I saw what she meant. Nothing in the clinical protocol could have explained such an upswing. There was no doubt about that and no margin for error whatsoever. She inhaled deeply and held her breath for a few seconds before releasing the air. To put it simply, we keep meticulous notes and label everything painstakingly, and there is no possible way that we could have fertilized the wrong egg or implanted the wrong embryo by mistake. And these results would suggest that several people had made the same mistake more than once. That was just not possible. Clearly, the trust of these patients had been deliberately breached. Basically, they were not carrying or had not given birth to their own child, but to someone else's. Did you confide in Leopold about this? No. I didn't know whether he was somehow involved. I couldn't take the risk. Signe clasped her hands together and stared at the empty wall. And so you met with Louise the next day? Bergström prompted. She nodded. I told her the truth, that I suspected the clinic must be involved in trafficking eggs and embryos. So we decided to examine those files more closely to see where the eggs and embryos could have come from. That was when we decided it would be safer to use unregistered mobiles to communicate with each other. She clicked her tongue against the roof of her mouth as if she might be thirsty. It turned out to be a long, painstaking process. We didn't want to arouse any suspicion ourselves, so we had to be extremely careful at the clinic about consulting patient files and anything to do with egg and embryo traceability. She glanced up at the commissioner briefly before returning her gaze to the table. We ended up discovering that our clinic was working in partnership, so to speak, with the clinic in Madrid, La Virgen del Pilar. Signe Skor paused for a moment and swallowed before she carried on. Here's an example to give you an idea of how the arrangement worked. This patient, let's call her patient X, is on her 4th cycle of IVF and it fails. She decides to take a break for 3 cycles, so about 3 months. Then she comes back to see us again. It's rare for patients to change clinics because they don't want to have to go through all the preliminary tests again, not to mention pay for it all. At that point, the Lindbergh Clinic contacts La Virgen del Pilar to place an order. Patient X is blonde with blue eyes, and her husband, or sperm donor, also has fair hair and blue eyes. They share the same blood group, too, A positive. So patient X needs an embryo from 2 parents with the same genetic profile. The clinic in Madrid then searches in its bank of unused embryos that patients have either kept for several years after having children or that were supposed to be destroyed but weren't, for 2 top-quality specimens to implant in patient X's uterus to ensure her the best possible chances of a successful pregnancy. And, obviously, that arrangement worked in the opposite direction, too. She rubbed her eyes with her fingertips. So, Louise and I went to see Göran at their home in Falkenberg, and we confronted him with what we had found.
Signe sighed. He admitted it straight away, what they were doing at the clinic. He told us that yes, he had instigated this exchange, as he put it. He insisted that it wasn't trafficking, as we had so vulgarly labeled it, and that it had nothing to do with the success rates of his clinic or its reputation, and even less to do with the financial repercussions of its popularity. He maintained that it was all about the sense of completeness that came from motherhood and parenthood. She closed her eyes and shook her head frantically. Louise was furious. She flew completely off the handle. She was yelling and screaming, and she grabbed her father. She had her hands around his neck like this. Signe tensed her fingers into a claw shape. Göran didn't try to fight her off. He waited until she calmed down. Then he said he understood that she was angry. He told her that he was sorry that she didn't understand his reasoning and couldn't see things the way he did. Louise did calm down in the end, and the three of us sat there in silence. You know, the kind of silence that sets in after something catastrophic has happened. Alexei knew what that silence was like. It was desolate, and only shock and grief drifted like tumbleweeds across the landscape as you contemplated what you had lost. Signe ran her tongue over her lips again. She was so desperate for water now. The contours of her mouth looked chapped, but Bergström clearly didn't want to interrupt her. Louise resigned right after, and she went to work for SKF in Denmark. She cut off all contact with her parents. Well, she still came to family gatherings from time to time and played her role as a sister and daughter, but only for Alianor's sake. Did Kerstin know what was going on? Of course she knew what was going on. Those two were like conjoined twins. Göran could have never embarked on a project of that scale without talking to Kerstin or without her suspecting it. What about you? How did you react? Me? She exhaled with a long sigh that almost turned into a laugh of despair. I could only think about Leopold, about his name being dragged through the mud, about the clinic he had given his heart and soul to, and all the happy families we were going to have to shatter by telling the parents the child they had cherished for months or years was not their own. I decided to keep my mouth shut in the end. But I did ask Göran to stop the trafficking. It was one thing to find out about something like that after the fact, but another thing entirely to turn a blind eye and condone it while it was still going on. Then, La Virgen del Pilar was shut down, and that resolved a lot of things. There was a scandal that led to that clinic being closed. Yes, I know, she interrupted. Dr. Burgos was fertilizing patients' eggs with his own sperm. I know what you're going to ask me, and I don't have the answer. The truth is, I don't know whether Göran was doing the same thing. He told me he wasn't, but I only have his word for it. How many families were affected, Signe, by this trafficking at the Lindberg clinic? Signe Skor swallowed and picked at the white film that had now formed at the corners of her lips. 187. 187 families since 2001. Coca, Spain. Monday, the 12th of December, 2016, 12 p.m. So, this Signe Skor, I can't believe these Scandinavian names, Guardiola muttered from the back seat of the hire car. Well, if that isn't the pot calling the kettle black, Alexei teased, is it really any better to give people names that translate to pillar, remedy, and loneliness? At least our names don't get caught in your throat. So you're telling me this Signe didn't say anything? She didn't alert the authorities? And she just kept working for that man? Alongside him? Joder. The police must be tearing the place apart now, eh? I suppose your commissioner and his team must have their hands full with that. No, it's all in the Gothenburg police's hands. That's where the Lindbergh Clinic is. Emily turned into a gravel driveway, crunching the car tires and raising a cloud of dust in their wake. She parked in front of a quaint, whitewashed house with windows framed in red brick. Pedro Santos had lost his wife 2 years earlier. Beatriz Núñez, who went by her maiden name, as per the Spanish tradition, had been found at home, stabbed to death with her tongue cut out. Hers was one of the 6 cold cases they had identified in the main police database. Beatriz Núñez, Carlos Burgos, and the Lindberghs could feasibly have been killed by the same person. An elderly gentleman opened the door to them. With his earnest face and carefully combed back white hair, there was a haughty, dignified air about him. Sí. Buenos días, Señor Santos? Alexei asked. Buenos días. I'm Alexei Castells, and these are my colleagues Emily Roy and Vicente Guardiola, she continued in Spanish. Thank you for agreeing to see us. I'm sorry we're a bit early. The elderly gent frowned. We spoke on the telephone yesterday about your late wife, Alexei prompted, flashing her best smile. You suggested we come by today, at 12:30, to talk about Beatriz. I know what my wife's called. His face hardened. He retreated a step and turned his back on them. Baez, he called into the house. Sí, Pedro, came a female voice in response, muffled by the sounds of doors opening and closing. Come, and bring the book, will you? Sí, Pedro, sí. A determined click-clacking of hurried steps across the tiled floor drew nearer, announcing the arrival of a petite woman dressed all in black. Her apron was covered in flour. Baez? Alexei hesitantly asked. Sí, bueno. Pedro here always calls me by my last name. We spoke to Señor Santos on the telephone yesterday. We're working for the police in Sweden in collaboration with the Spanish police. Yes, I remember. I saw that in the book. She opened the little notebook she was carrying and flipped through a few pages. See, Pedro, there it is, she pointed. Meet the Castells, 12:30 Monday the 12th. That's what you wrote. The elderly gent looked at them with a mix of surprise and confusion. See, there it is, look. He peered at the notebook. Oh, yes, so it is. I'm sorry. If you'll excuse me, I'm going to watch TV now. Come in, Señora Baez beckoned to them. Would you like a little cafecito, Pedro? Sí, Baez, gracias. Coffee sounds good. All right, I'll bring you one. Go up and rest, and I'll bring it to you. He strode off swiftly down the hall and went upstairs. Baez ushered them into a small room with a 3-seater sofa nestled behind a round table. It was covered with a tablecloth that draped down and kissed the floor. Please, sit there, she insisted, motioning to the sofa. I prefer the armchair anyway. Would you all like a coffee? I've just made empanadas. I'll bring some through. She turned and disappeared without waiting for the reply. Vicente and Alexei sat down on the sofa and promptly pulled the tablecloth over their legs. Emily sat beside Alexei, with a curious sideways glance at her legs. It's called a mesa camilla, Emily, Guardiola explained, clearly amused. There's a heater under the table. The tablecloth acts like a blanket to keep your bum nice and warm, so you don't turn into a stalagmite while you're eating. With unusual obedience, Emily followed suit and lifted the tablecloth over her knees, too. Señora Baez came back into the room, carrying a tray with a pot of coffee and 4 cups, and a plate laden with golden brown pastries. Thought Alexei, as the aroma stimulated her appetite. She doesn't speak Spanish, does she? Said Señora Baez, nodding her chin towards Emily. No, but I do understand more than enough, Emily replied in a shaky Hispanic tone. Oh, well, the way you were looking at me so intensely, I wasn't sure you could understand what I was saying. Emily smiled. So you've driven up from Madrid, have you? How long did that take? Señora Baez continued as she poured the coffee. About an hour and a half, Guardiola replied, helping himself to an empanada. Baez picked up one of the coffees, added milk and 2 sugars, and gave it a stir. Dios, Señora Baez, divinas! Guardiola exclaimed, with his mouth full. These are exquisite. Ah, que sí, they are, aren't they? She smiled proudly, settling into her wingback armchair. So, what's happening? Have you caught whoever did that to Beatriz? Excuse me, Señora Baez, but are you related to Pedro or Beatriz? Alexei said, trying to steer the interview back on track. She burst out laughing and slapped her hands on her thighs. You're going to think I'm the one who's out of my mind. Not with empanadas like that, Guardiola winked. Ah, isn't he a charmer? Watch out, you two, she tutted with a cautionary wave of her index finger before reaching for an empanada of her own and taking a hearty bite. It's a bit late for that, Alexei thought. Emily had already succumbed to Guardiola's charms. Of course, she hadn't said anything to Alexei, but she hadn't tried to hide it either. Guardiola had emerged from Emily's room earlier, freshly showered. Maybe she and Jack, Detective Chief Superintendent Jack Pierce, her colleague and superior at Scotland Yard, weren't together anymore, although he was coming with her to the wedding. I've been looking after Pedro, Beatriz's husband, since she died, Señora Baez explained, once she had finished her mouthful of empanada. Alzheimer's, that's what the doctors are saying he's got. She shrugged and frowned dubiously. Good heavens, it broke his heart to lose Beatriz, and the head can't work properly without the heart, can it? Oh, and did he ever love his Beatriz? Ba, like a man, of course, by which I mean he loved himself more, but he really did love her to bits. She took a sip of coffee before continuing. Beatriz was my sister. Well, my soul sister, I suppose. We grew up together. Creases spread across Señora Baez's face. She pulled the tablecloth over her legs and swept the crumbs to the middle of the table. It was Pedro who found her, upstairs, right outside their bedroom door, hanging on to the banister with one hand, as if she didn't want to go. After that, losing his mind was the last thing Pedro needed. You know what state she was in, don't you? Of course you do. Of course. Can you imagine what kind of person could ever inflict that on someone? Evil incarnate, I tell you. Whoever killed Beatriz really spent a long time making a mess of her. She shook her head and swept more crumbs away with the back of her hand. Our sweet Beatriz. Whatever did she do to deserve so much hate? She would have been one of those little old ladies who never bothered a soul. You know, the kind who'll just sit in an armchair and be content to look at her grandchildren and great-grandchildren living their lives all around her. Emily glanced at Alexei. Alexei gulped. Señora Baez, I'm afraid I have something unpleasant to ask you. Si, guapa. I thought you might. Otherwise you wouldn't be here, would you, my pretty? Would you happen to know, when Pedro found his wife, whether he put her clothes back on? Dios mío. Good heavens, she wasn't. No, she wasn't. Was she? No, she wasn't. Sexually assaulted, no. Alexei was quick to clarify, but her buttocks and private parts were burned.
Senora Baez started to shake from head to toe. She clasped her hands on the table, digging her nails into her flesh in an attempt to pull herself together. With a candle? They burned her with a candle, didn't they? She stuttered.
This is the end of CD 6. The book continues on CD 7.